This story is told in the perspective of a female. This happened to me a few days ago on my way home after a long and busy day at work. I work right smack in the middle of downtown Salt Lake City, and I lived in the suburbs, so it was a long drive back home. My boss, being the asshole he was, gave me a week of closing shifts during the week I was supposed to be out of town for vacation. However, he said that the company needed extra help and told me I couldn't go. Needless to say, I was pissed, but hey, you can't always win, right? It was around 7, maybe 8 o'clock at night, and I had about an hour to get home. I ended up taking a different route home, as this route would only take me about 45 minutes than the hour drive. Seeing the fact that I was dead tired and just wanting to go home, I decided to take the route. According to my GPS, I was about halfway home, listening to my music, when I hear my car start making this rattling noise. I cussed myself as this noise continues, causing my car to come to a complete stop. Thankfully though, the road was empty, as no one ever used it at this time of night, but that obviously didn't solve the car problem. For context, I drive a 2003 Honda Civic, aka box, which always had problems with it. I'm only 19 and my job doesn't pay enough for me to afford a new car. I work 20 hours a week, making $15 an hour, so it was the only thing I could afford. I pop the hood and take a look at the car to see that my car battery was full of corrosion. Out of anger, I hit my car, knowing that I'd have to call a tow truck, which could be a mission seeing how far I was from the city. That being said, I called AAA, but they said it could take a while to send someone out due to the distance. Alright, whatever, I guess I didn't have a choice, right? Needless to say, I bite my lip, just waiting inside my car for the tow truck to come. After a while, I started to notice how alone I was on this road. It was dead silent, and all I could hear were the crickets from the woods. As I'm playing a game on my phone, I look in my rearview mirror and see a pair of headlights approaching me from the back. The closer it came, the more I made it out to be a truck. I thought that it could have been the tow truck, but as it pulled up behind my car, I saw that it was definitely not a tow truck. It was just a standard white pickup truck, and that's when I saw a man that appeared to be Hispanic step out and tap on my window. I'd say he was maybe in his mid-50s, asking me if I needed a lift. Trying to be safe, I lower my window just a tad and tell him that my car broke down, but that the tow truck was on its way. I thank him for the offer, but told him I had everything under control and that I didn't want to be a bother. For some reason though, this guy didn't seem to get the hint and began to ask me if I could open the door for him and that he could help me. This started to concern me now. He wasn't going away and was now trying to get in my car. Keep in mind, there's nobody else on this road, and I'm basically in the middle of nowhere with this person who seemed as if they were up to no good. He stares at me through the window for a good minute or so before walking back to his truck. I thought that was the end of it and that he would finally drive off, but boy was I wrong. After spending about 5 minutes in his truck, he comes back out and motions for me to roll down my window. I comply and roll down my window a bit and ask him what he wanted. This time in a more annoyed tone, as I didn't want anything to do with him. Somehow he notices my change of behavior and says that he's just trying to help and that there's no reason to get angry with him. I tell him that I didn't need help and that the tow truck would take care of me. He then goes on to explain that he had a pair of jumper cables in his truck and could easily get my car started. At this point, I see yet another pair of headlights coming from behind me and instantly recognized it as the tow truck. Yeah, look man, help is already here. Thank you for the offer, but I'd rather have the tow truck help me. By this point, the tow truck driver gets out and the man then looks both ways, turns to me, and walks back to his truck driving away. The tow truck driver then comes to my window and I open my door explaining the issue with my car's battery. As I'm telling him what's going on, he stops me mid-sentence and asks if I knew who that man was. I told him no and that he just pulled up behind me and tried to help. The tow truck driver just stared at me with this pale face and said that he's actually seen that man before. Turns out, he was a registered sex offender from 2 towns over and would sometimes be on this road at night looking to lure any unsuspecting women. This ranged anywhere from getting him to go with him somewhere to attempting to get in their cars, which is exactly what he tried doing. He was released from prison 3 years ago for good behavior and hasn't been seen since. The tow truck driver was almost certain it was him, as he was able to get a good look at him from the headlights of the tow truck. He tows my car away, with him giving me a ride to the police station, making sure I was safe. I couldn't give an accurate description to the police, other than that his truck was white. The police said they do some investigative work, but never got back to me about any leads. It's been almost a week now, and I'm still paranoid knowing that he's probably still out there. Had I been that dumb or naive to open my door or window for him, God, I don't even know what he might have done. One thing I will take from this is that I'll never drive down that road at night again, and I always carry pepper spray with me. This story is a bit short, but this is seriously one of the creepiest moments of my life. I'm a 26-year-old female and I was driving home from a friend's birthday party one night. I live in a very rural area of Tennessee, so there's a lot of hills, forests, and flatlands throughout most of the state. Anyway, on this particular night, I was driving through I-81 between Knoxville and Bristol. It was around 2 a.m. on a weeknight, so there were no other cars on this road other than mine. Now, whenever I'm out late at night, I always remember to have my nighttime coffee. This night, however, I didn't have my coffee, which caused me to become exhausted while behind the wheel. So there I am, driving for about 25 minutes when, out of nowhere, something jumps out onto the road from the trees. This scared me to the bone, causing me to let out an oh shit and brake hard. It looked like a person, to be honest, who just straight up jumped in front of my car as if they were trying to get hit. I only caught a glimpse of them and tried to see if I had ran someone over. I was ready to give this person a piece of my mind and got out of my car to see not a soul in sight. I was seemingly the only person on this road, and right then I started freaking out, wondering what the hell just happened. After taking a few minutes to compose myself, I get back in my car only for it to not start. I tried starting the engine several times, but nothing I did ever made it work. Long story short, I called a tow truck to give me a ride, and it took about a month to get my car back up and running. Till this day, I'm strongly convinced that whatever I had seen was completely paranormal and was the reason for my car dying. So, I'm a 25-year-old male, and this happened just last year in the summer. I was on a road trip from Albuquerque, New Mexico to Los Angeles, California. The reason for this trip was to visit my old friend from my childhood who I hadn't seen in years. Moving away from one of your best friends is enough to make anyone feel lonely and sad. His name was Jason, and we had been good friends ever since I could remember. I had only saw him once a year when I had time off from work, so this trip was very important to me. If I remember correctly, I was driving down a long stretch of road somewhere in Arizona when my car suddenly dies out of nowhere. Being rightfully pissed off, I hit my dashboard while trying to get the damn thing to start. Eventually, I get out of my car and open the hood. My car's battery had been covered in battery acid and had spread throughout the other components. I was stuck on an empty road in the middle of nowhere with nothing but desert and cliffs. I took out my phone to try and get a hold of Jason to see if he could come get me. When we were younger teens, we'd always have this little slogan when trying to reach each other. It went something along the lines of, "So-and-so, do you copy?" And I repeat the catchphrase, attempting to reach him. "Hey Jason, do you copy? I'm in a bit of a pickle here." However, signal around here was basically non-existent, so I had no other choice but to walk to the nearest town. All the while, I'm still trying to reach Jason, but there was no luck. About 15 minutes into my walk, I look behind me and notice two headlights in the distance getting closer and closer. It only took me a second to realize that it was a car, and I flagged them down while practically begging for help. Believe it or not, it seemed as if my prayers had come true, as the car then starts to slow down and pulls up next to me. Inside was an older-looking gentleman, and in the back were two younger men with a middle-aged woman wearing sunglasses in the middle. The two men seemed to be carrying her as she appeared to be asleep. The driver asked as to how they could be a help, and I explained my situation to them. One of the men in the back seat had said something about how that sounded like a you problem and that they'd be no help. I apologized, thanking them for their time, and told them I'd be on my way. However, that's when I noticed the woman in the car. She looked slumped over and just appeared to be out of it. I then asked in a direct tone to the driver, "Everything alright with her?" He then looks at the men, looks at me, and says, No, she's dead, but why is that your concern?" One of the men in the back take off her sunglasses, revealing her face. The second I saw her face, I can now see as to why she was deceased. Her lifeless body limped over the two men with her mouth hung open as if it had been broken. The driver then looks at me and says 6 words that have haunted me ever since. Calling the cops would be a mistake. I then back off and start running back to my car as the other car sped off until they were too far to be seen. Thankfully, my car willingly started back up again, where I was able to go to the next town and get a new battery. I obviously did inform the police about my encounter and gave them an exact description of the men. Up until now, however, there have been unfortunately no leads as to who might have been responsible. In the end, I did get to see my friend, and nothing happened again while on that trip. There are truly some sick and twisted people in this world that we just have to live with. It's unfortunately a harsh reality of life.
Hey everyone, my name is Dennis Blaze. I was around 17 when this happened. And to give you an idea of how long ago this took place, I am now 43 years old. I grew up in a small town across from Seattle during the late 90s. At the time, there was maybe a total population of 6,000 to 7,000 people. The town didn't really have a whole lot of things to do. One night I was hanging out with my 3 friends, who we'll call Gary, Mark, and Rob. We all got bored of just sitting at home, so we decided to go for a drive. We stopped to eat at a McDonald's before continuing our aimless endeavor. We had been driving for about 15 minutes after we left the restaurant. It must have been about 10 p.m. at this point. My vehicle was a '92 Ford Probe. Mark rolled down his window. I didn't think anything of it at first. I just figured he needed some air. We were descending a large hill when I saw a pair of headlights in the distance. The lights got closer, and I saw that it was a semi-truck, but it wasn't hauling a trailer behind it. As the semi-truck was approaching, I could see Mark sitting forward. I wasn't sure what he was doing. I then saw him throw something at the truck as it passed. "What the hell are you doing?" "Relax, it was just a sweet and sour packet from the Nuggets." I was annoyed, but I didn't think anything would happen. We got to the bottom of the hill, When I looked into the rearview mirror, I could now see the headlights from the semi-truck barreling down the hill, rushing directly at my car. Holy shit. Everyone in the car turned around at once. I think he just pissed him off, Mark. I quickly found a driveway to turn around, then raced back up the hill as fast as I could to gain some distance from the semi-truck. When I got to the top of the hill, I turned off all my lights, and everyone in the car told me to turn down this side road that was pitch dark. I could barely see a thing, but I decided to go for it. I then turned the car back around before putting it in park. We thought it would be a good idea to wait for a few minutes before heading back to my house. We waited for about 2 minutes when we saw those damn headlights coming in our direction. I couldn't believe it. The truck driver must have seen us turn down this road. I thought for sure we had lost him. The massive truck seemingly blocked our only way out. It came to a full stop. We then heard the driver's side door opening. Soon the driver was illuminated by his own headlights. This man looked huge. What the hell should we do, Mark? You're the one who got us into this. What do you think we should do? Let's get the out of here. I don't think I have enough room to get around him. No, that's not true. On the left, there's a clearing. He's not hauling a trailer, so if you floor it now, you should have just enough room to get around him. I decided to trust Mark and stepped on the gas pedal. I narrowly missed hitting the man. I remember him angrily shouting at us as we zoomed past. Who knows what he would have done if he got his hands on any one of us. Mark turned out to be correct. I had just enough room to make it out of there, and I floored it all the way back home. My parents were at the casino that night, and they weren't going to be home for at least a few more hours. We locked all the doors and closed the curtains, checking every couple of minutes for any headlights. When we were convinced that we were no longer in danger, we all had a good laugh about the whole situation. It was crazy. I told Mark he's no longer allowed to eat chicken nuggets again. I'm glad we all made it out of there safely. But I'll never forget the fear I felt when I was staring down those headlights on that dark road.
About 5 years ago, I was driving back home from work late one night. I worked at a restaurant/bar at the time and often worked very late. So it was past midnight when I was finally going home and driving my Honda Accord. I lived with my parents during this time in a neighborhood about 10 minutes from my job. So after leaving work, I got onto the roads, which were very quiet, as they often were in the late night hours. It was a huge difference from when I would go to work and there would be lots of cars on the road, to when I would drive home and there would be basically nobody. So within probably 2 or 3 minutes of driving home, I did notice a car behind me. When it started following me though, I had no idea. I kept driving home and was realizing that the car behind me was turning wherever I did. Soon, I was very suspicious that I was being followed. I was never quite 100% sure though. I thought maybe it was a neighbor or something. There are many other houses in the neighborhood. Still, I was suspicious by it. Soon, I had made it to the street where my parents' house was. I turned onto it, and the car behind me did the same. I actually thought about driving around the block or turning around, but ultimately, I drove to my house and pulled into the driveway. I remember being really nervous as I was pulling in that the car would as well, but it didn't. Instead, the car kept going down the street. I felt much better, and then got out of my car and walked inside. By now, my parents and sister had long gone to bed upstairs. The lights were off inside the house, and it was very quiet. I went into the kitchen to make some ramen noodles or something like that. I was very hungry and wanted something quick to have before bed. As I was waiting for the water to heat up though, I casually walked around a little. I went into the living room and glanced out the front window. That's when I noticed a car driving extremely slow down the street, and I further noticed that it was the same car that had seemingly followed me all the way home. Now I was very suspicious. I continued to watch out the window. The car then turned and parked on the side of the street just past our house. I heard the engine turn off and then watched the driver's door open and saw a man get out. He then started walking towards our front yard. That's when I jumped back from the window so that he wouldn't see me. I went back into the kitchen and just hoped that this guy wasn't going to try to break in or something. Seconds later though, there was a knock at the front door. My heart started racing. What could this guy possibly want? Several moments went by and he knocked again. I slowly walked into the living room and went to a window. When I looked outside, I saw the man walking away from the front door, but he wasn't going back to his car. Instead, he walked around the side of our house. I went back into the kitchen and looked out of a back window. I was very careful when I was looking so that I wouldn't be seen. The man appeared to walk through the backyard. He made his way through the backyard and then went out of sight again. I then went back to the front of the house. When I looked out of the window, I didn't see the guy for a while. Soon though, I saw him going through the front yard. He went back to his car, then got inside. Then he drove away. After that, I went back to what I was doing. I looked out of the window a few more times that night, but he didn't come back. I still wonder who he was, why he followed me home, and what he was doing.
Back when I was 18 years old, for about 6 months, my boss drove me to work. I know that may sound a little weird, but I didn't get a license yet, and he knew my mom. It also helped that he lived about 2 minutes from my house. It was just a weird situation, and no matter how I try to preface it, I just know that it sounds weird. Most mornings, the drive to work was uneventful. We'd usually get to work at around 6:30 a.m., and neither one of us would talk in the car. He was usually hungover, and I just wasn't the talkative type. I'm a quiet person by nature, but I was even quieter back then. One day, we had to go to work at 3 in the morning for inventory. My boss decided it would be good to show me, so I got up extra early for that 3 a.m. shift. On the way into work that morning, my boss said that he wanted to grab some coffee at the gas station since it was the only place that was open. When we parked, as he was getting out of the car, he told me that he was going to hit the restroom as well. I just nodded and decided to wait in the car. I was exhausted from staying up way too late playing video games, and I was planning on just resting my eyes until we got to work. I'm assuming a few minutes had passed. I don't know exactly how long it was because I was falling asleep while I was waiting for my boss. With no notice, the back seat door opened, and it startled me in my half-asleep state. I just thought it was my boss, and then I felt movement behind me. I finally looked behind me, and just sitting there in the back seat was a woman. She didn't appear to be homeless or look like she was on anything. She just looked strange. And we made eye contact for a few seconds, and then I whipped back around trying to process what was happening. I'm a really quiet person, and I was even more quiet back then, like I said, and I didn't know what to say or what to do. I was just hoping my boss was going to come back out soon. I started to finally work up the courage to ask what was going on, and I was immediately freaked out when I turned around. She was sitting there, now smiling, but looking forward. I don't really know how to describe her eyes. They were cold and dark and seemed almost lifeless, even though she was kind of pretty. Even as I write this, I still can't get the image of her out of my mind. It had probably been about 30 seconds since all this started, and I finally uttered my words when I asked her, "Hey, is everything okay? You know this isn't your car, right?" Instead of answering with words, she just started to scream, erratically. It was so erratic that it was shaking the entire car, it felt like, or maybe just my head. I jumped back just out of panic, confusion, and shock, and I saw my boss walking out of the gas station. I just dove out of the passenger side door and shut it behind me. My boss was confused and asked me what the heck was going on, and I just pointed to the woman in the back seat of his car. We both just stood there, almost in amazement and disbelief. She was still screaming, shaking and rocking back and forth. We could physically see the car shaking from her wild movements from inside the car. My boss approached the back seat where she was sitting, and as he grabbed the door handle, she put both her hands on the window, and I kid you not, started to hiss and growl at my boss. He said, "Nope," and walked back towards me. I was standing probably 10 feet away at this point. He immediately called the police, and we were hoping that they would arrive soon since it was a small town. The entire time that we were waiting for the cops, we could hear the woman screaming and the car still shaking. After a minute or two of waiting for the police, we went inside and watched her from inside the gas station. There was just something unsettling about the entire situation. She wasn't trying to rob us. She only looked like she wanted to cause harm when we got near the car. I mean, she was sitting in the back seat, so she wasn't even trying to steal the car. It was just all so weird. The cops showed up maybe 5 minutes after the call. We went outside to greet the officer and fill him in on the situation, and he looked confused, and I'm not gonna lie, he almost looked kind of amused by the whole situation. The officer tried to get the woman to come out calmly, but after a minute of her screaming and growling, he basically went into the car and apprehended her. And this is where this bad dream truly turned into a nightmare. Upon arrest, the officer had to remove 4 knives from her person. Yeah, you heard that right. This woman had 4 sharp objects on her. Thankfully, she never showed us the knives or even hinted at the fact that she had them. But even more disturbing, perhaps, is the fact that she didn't have an ID on her and she wasn't talking, so the officer had no idea who she was. This complete stranger came out of nowhere. She got into my boss's car without saying a word. She went from smiling to off-the-wall insane. Then, to cap things off, she had no ID and 4 deadly weapons on her. I've had some wild things happen to me over the years, but I'd have to say that this was probably the strangest and most terrifying that's ever happened to me. It's been years, and I remember this moment like it was yesterday. I'll never forget that woman's face, and I honestly wonder what she's up to now.
A few years ago, I was working at a pizza chain in my local town of Ocala, Florida as a delivery driver. Those who are familiar with Central Florida will probably know what I'm talking about. Rolling hills, flatlands, springs, swamps, you name it, Ocala had it all. I was 25, but I made damn good money doing it as rural families were generally more wealthy than most. I had worked at many other places before, both local and chain, but I favored local businesses more. I'd also like to note that I'm a firm believer in God and thank Him till this day for saving my life. One night I was working and I had an order of 5 large pies to deliver. People don't normally order this much amount of pizza around here, so I could only assume it was a party of some type. My boss wrote down the address for me, and it was on the more busier side of town. This made me feel comfortable, as I typically don't like delivering to rural homes far apart from each other. I'm still not sure why, but that's just how it was. That being said, I do the delivery and drove over to the address, which took me to an apartment complex in town. I had never seen this complex before, as I normally don't go over to the center of town, but I guess it was nice to do deliveries at different locations. I grab the order and go up to the apartment and knock on room 104. This will be important in the story later. I was greeted to a younger guy, I'd say a little younger than me, as well as another guy who appeared to be the same age. Order for Caleb? I said. Without even saying a word, one of the men takes the pizza from me while the other said in a very blunt voice as to how much it was. I tell them the total came out to be $60.83, and the two just look at each other in confusion. One of them spoke up, giving me the side eye as he said that that wasn't what he was told over the phone. "Oh, let me double check. Maybe I made a mistake," I said. Okay, so I obviously knew that this had to be the correct amount, as my boss makes us triple check all details, so I knew I had this right. I read over the receipt just to be sure, and lo and behold, I was indeed correct. I show them the receipt for proof, and that's when I see one of them nervously looking around while the other is just staring at me. The very second I was about to say something, one of the men pulls out a gun and points it at my head. At that point, I couldn't even speak or begin to form a sentence for that matter. The kid with the gun says in this really raspy voice to hand him my wallet, keys, and phone or he won't hesitate to pull the trigger. I very nervously said okay and slowly reached into my pockets for all my belongings he requested and handed them to him. They then tell me to come inside slowly and to sit down on one of the chairs by the kitchen table. I comply and walk over to the kitchen where one of them sits me down and proceeds to tie my hands with duct tape. I was pretty much screwed at this point as I couldn't go anywhere as they had the keys to the company car and they sure as hell wouldn't give them back. One of the guys opens my phone and starts to go through it, deleting anything he could find. At one point, I see him land on a picture of my girlfriend, which shocked me to my core. Just a year ago, my girlfriend died in a fatal car crash and I had photos of her on my phone to keep as memories. Hey, please don't delete those. They're the only thing I have left to remember my girlfriend. However, they didn't seem to care and actually ended up deleting them purely out of spite. I'll admit I got teared up a bit seeing them do that and didn't know what else to do other than to just sit there and watch. I remember sitting there just wondering as to what the hell these people were gonna do to me, and I almost threw up. All the while, I'm praying to God I make it out safe and to let me go from whatever this was. I'd say I kept asking them what they wanted from me several times before one of them just demands for me to shut up. Now, this is the part where things take an unexpected turn. As they were going through my phone while also counting the money in my wallet, we all hear the sound of a window crash in one of the rooms of their apartment. This noise obviously concerned them as they took off running to the room where they heard it. I hear one of them shout, "Who's there?" Had someone broken into their apartment? I thought to myself. What actually happened will leave you speechless. Right then, I knew that this was my chance to leave and start biting off the tape tighter on my hands, hoping to rip it off. Somehow I managed to do this and was set free within a few seconds as I was biting down pretty hard. I knew that they would be back any second, and so I just run toward the door and start unlocking the 3 locks that were built into the door. Yeah, no wonder why they don't want anyone finding out about this, I thought to myself. I make it out the door and book it out of the apartment building, not looking back and just trying to find help. It was then when I remembered I didn't have my phone, so I couldn't call the police, so I took that chance to run to the nearest shop. They were thankfully very polite and let me use their phone to call the police. Law enforcement was more professional in Ocala compared to major cities in Florida, so they got here relatively fast. However, when they asked me what room they were in, I couldn't remember the damn room number. This apartment building was huge, with about 100 plus rooms, so I couldn't remember the number. Eventually, I had remembered that I wrote it down, and police then went up to go investigate. Turns out that loud crash we heard was actually a large tree smashing a window. The tree had been broken from the storm and just so happened to fall through the window. As for those 2 men, they were gone. They must have left through the front door when they realized I had already been gone. Needless to say, they were never caught, even after an investigation. Till this day, I feel that tree smashing the window was a distraction made by God to help me escape. I guess it could have been some stroke of luck, but I honestly have no idea. I'm a male, currently 22 and in college going for my bachelor's. I have a part-time job at a hospital, but I also did DoorDash on the side to earn more money. This happened last week during one of my delivery trips, and it's by far the creepiest thing I've ever experienced in my 2+ years of DoorDash. I was out one night with my friend during the middle of the week looking for any orders we could take. Since it was 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night, there weren't many places open besides fast food. My friend had come along with me as I liked the company, and let's face it, driving alone sucks. Eventually, I get a few orders here and there until I got one that was a little ways away from my normal delivery radius. It was about a 25-minute drive, but at the end of the day, it meant more money in my pocket. Whoever it was ordered from a nearby McDonald's, which was expected at this time of night. That said, I retrieved the order, and before I knew it, we were already halfway to the destination. My GPS led us to one of those terrace homes that always seemed like one big townhouse that you would commonly see. The customer had noted that they wanted it handed to them, which I sort of hated if I'm being honest. Most people would prefer if it were left at the door, but I guess not everyone is the same. My friend and I grabbed the order and start heading toward the door. However, as we were getting ready to ring the doorbell, the door immediately opens where we were greeted to a younger-looking Asian man. He appeared to be in his late 20s or early 30s and was absolutely stoned. However, he was still stable and was able to make conversation with us, and he actually seemed pretty cool at first. He asked us how our night was, how old we were, and where we went to school. You know, casual small talk questions. Granted, he had somewhat of a small accent, but we could still understand what he was saying. After about a good 5 minutes of chatting, we hand him his order and he just puts it on the table next to him and says something we didn't expect. Still stoned out of his mind, he asks us if we'd be interested in having a beer with him. I look at my friend and he sort of just shrugs and says sure. Normally I'd say no, but seeing as to how chill this guy was, we didn't think anything of it. We walk into the house and he hands us each a cold beer and proceeds to start up an actual conversation with us, mostly about his life. At one point, he gets up and tells us to wait as he says he has to step out to take a quick phone call. The man steps into another room and shuts the door behind him. So there we were, just chilling while talking to my friend when I hear the man speaking Japanese in another room. Now, my stepmother is from Japan, so while I understand a fair bit of Japanese, I don't speak it. So I hear him talking but pay no attention because it's rude to eavesdrop and all. That was until he said something along the lines of, "The people in my kitchen won't find out." That's when my ears perk up. To put it simply, he was basically talking to someone on the phone and how he was planning on keeping us silent just in case. That was enough to quietly tell my friend what was going on and that we had to leave. However, as we got up, he comes back out and sees the look on our faces, and it was at that point where he had caught on. His face went from a friendly smile to a disappointed look as if he knew we had hurt him. I tell him that it was nice to meet him, but that we had to go. He said nothing and just watches us as we walk out the door, not saying a word. As soon as we start the car, we see him come out of the house waving a gun like a madman. He fires 2 shots into my front fender of my car before we hightail it out of there. All the while, my friend is crying as he swore a bullet ripped through his seat. We drive for about 10 minutes before I call the police to explain my situation. After giving a description of this man to the police, they had sent in squads of police units to the address. Turns out, this guy was a member of the Japanese Yakuza and was wanted for murder and importing illegal goods into the US. He used an alias for about 4 years and was somehow never caught. I don't know about you, but encountering a mafia member is probably the scariest thing that can happen to anyone. Shortly after entering his home, they had ended his life on the spot. For starters, authorities had found several files on his computer and even found drugs and weapons inside these crates he had locked away. All of these things were obviously highly illegal, and police even went as far as locking down the whole neighborhood. I'm not sure why they did this, but I guess that's just how these things work. The craziest thing about this is the fact that I fed him his last meal. That still bothers me for some reason till this day. My name is Alex, and this happened just yesterday late last night with my girlfriend. For a very brief 4 months or so, I worked as a delivery driver for a few food delivery apps at the time, mostly being active on Uber Eats and DoorDash, as those were the ones that tended to be more popular. I didn't expect to make big money from this side hustle, but it helped with other small things like groceries and utilities. I live in the suburbs of LA, which is a very crowded part of the city, so deliveries were usually quick and close. Anyway, this happened last night while my girlfriend and I were doing deliveries. We had just gotten home from a friend's party, and while most people would be exhausted, we were surprisingly still active. Not knowing what to do, my girlfriend and I decided we'd go out and do a few deliveries just to have some us time. Being in the car with a loved one always felt like a special sort of vibe. Anyway, almost immediately, someone requested a large order from a local Wingstop, and I was the one who accepted it. Big orders usually meant that the customer would have to tip more, aka more money for me. We drive to the location, and I tell my girlfriend to wait in the car while I go get the food. Now, Wingstop usually takes a bit of time before the order is ready, which meant I had to wait a few minutes. Once the food had been done, I grab it and start heading back to the car when I see my girlfriend is stoned as a statue. She's sitting in the front seat with her eyes wild and had a look of fear. At first, I was confused as to why she was like that and motioned for her to roll down the window while asking her what the hell happened. She slowly flicks the button and tells me in a shook voice to get in the car. I do just that, and we drove over to the destination while I continued to ask what was wrong. After what felt like forever, she finally tells me everything, and what she told me made my stomach drop. As I was inside the restaurant waiting for the food, my girlfriend had been on her phone texting a friend when she looks out the window. Practically hovering over the window was a very large and tall man who looked to be at least 6'7". He wore all black and was staring at my girlfriend with this very angry look, and in his hand was a window smasher. His face was red and his eyes were menacing, as if he had this strong hatred towards my girlfriend. However, she couldn't move or say anything. She simply turned to face the front and hoped that he'd just leave. After about a decent minute, he thankfully did, and that was when I had come out of the restaurant. Now, there's no real way to say this without trying to brag, but my girlfriend is very pretty. Like, she's cute, and her looks would oftentimes attract a lot of faces. My theory was that the man who had come up to the car had seen her and knew she was with me, as he had probably been watching us. We didn't really bother calling the police, as there wasn't really something to be done about it. After that, we had called it a night and went straight home, as she couldn't shake off the paranoia. Up until now, I'm still not exactly sure as to what the man wanted or what his intentions were. But if he had a device to break windows, they couldn't have been good. From now on, my girlfriend and I have agreed that whenever we do orders together, that we'd both be the ones to go inside.
I'm a male, and I was around 8 or 9 when this happened. Obviously, I don't remember much since I was a kid, so I had recently asked my mom what she remembered about that day. My mom was taking my sister and I to see a movie. We had decided to stop at McDonald's to kill some time. A strange guy wearing a purple suit had followed us in and had sat at a nearby table without ordering anything. After we finished eating, I had got up to go clean up my retainer in the bathroom sink. The man followed me into the bathroom and then stood between me and the door. He asked me if I wanted a juice box. I said no, but he had told me that I needed to go out to his car with him so I could pick out the flavor. My parents had drilled into my head to never ever go with a stranger, so I immediately knew what was happening. I ran past him and out of the bathroom door into the lobby, then told my mom what had happened. He had followed me out and started coming towards us. My mom stood up and started making a big scene. She had loudly asked him why he was trying to get her son to go out to his car with him. He said that he was just trying to give me a juice box, and then hurriedly left and then got into his car and drove off. Luckily, there was a police car in the parking lot, so we had waved down a cop and told him what had happened. Unfortunately, the man in the purple suit was long gone by this point. I had forgotten most of what had happened before and after the incident, but I still vividly remember the terror I felt being alone in the bathroom with him blocking the door. It was only 10 to 20 seconds, but I'll never forget that uneasy feeling. I'm really grateful that my mom was such a rock star and that she knew how to make a scene to scare him off. I have no idea what would have happened to me had I actually gone out there with him. I'm a 17-year-old female, and I recently quit my job at a fast food chain after working there for almost 10 months. This story is part of the reason why I didn't want to stay much longer. I worked the drive-thru from 5 p.m. to 11 p.m. almost every weekend. Seeing regulars was not uncommon for me, and I would even memorize most of their orders and fill it out as soon as I heard their voice. Most were very polite and occasionally tipped, but on one particularly busy day, there was an unfamiliar, weary presence. I had just started my shift, so I was running food to the window. I had made eye contact with the man at the window in his car and immediately felt uneasy. I brushed it off because we were busy and I had work to do. Later on, once my manager set up my cash drawer, I took over drive-thru orders, payments, etc. There were lots of orders, so I wasn't paying special attention to specific voices or menu choices, but one had caught my attention. It was a low, hesitant voice asking for a sandwich. I give the man the total and he waits in line. He arrives at the window and it's the man from earlier. I assumed that he just forgot to order something. Now, his car was pretty low to the ground, so he had to extend his arm out to hand me his debit card. As he does this, he then mumbles something under his breath without even breaking eye contact with me. "I'm sorry, what was that?" I question him.
"I said you're looking beautiful today."
At this point, I'm super uncomfortable. Not only do I have a boyfriend, but I'm also underage and I'm not interested at all. "Oh, thank you," I said nervously. I then handed him the bag of food and then quickly shut the window until he drove away. I half-heartedly complained about him to some coworkers, all male as we usually do with weird customers, but I still had a strange gut feeling. A little while later, when the average wait in our line was about 10 minutes, I hear a familiar voice over the mic asking for a cup of water. It was low but agitated and forceful. I saw his face through the windshield and walked away from the window so that my manager would take care of him. This happened a couple of more times that day, asking for straws and other free things. At that point, I was pretty sure that he was just trying to look at me. I was so frustrated with him and the rest of my workday that I went to the bathroom and just cried. I usually have pretty thick skin when it comes to this kind of stuff, but I was just so over it. The rest of the night went on and I didn't see him again. I thought that I'd probably never see him again. That is, until my very last shift at the store a few months later. We weren't very busy that evening, but it was much later in the day than the first encounter. I didn't recognize the voice, but I had immediately recognized his face and car. I just swallowed my pride and took his payment, trying not to make eye contact. I had called my manager and he said he would give the food out for me. As suspected, the man was back in the drive-thru not long afterwards for a cup of water. This time I knew better. I had sent a male coworker to the window to get it for him since I was busy anyway. Once given the water, the man had actually asked my coworker,
"So, you guys close at 11 now, right?"
I was so glad that I was getting picked up by my mom that night. I was constantly looking out the windows, just making sure that he wasn't out there waiting for me. Call me paranoid, but I listen to enough true crime to be overly cautious.
My name is Danny, and this happened to me when I was living with my dad at the time of this story. My dad worked 2 jobs, and I was only 18 at the time and was a part-time college student, so my dad would oftentimes be called into work while I was either at home or school. This particular night, my dad had been called into work for one of his jobs for a possible storm emergency and wouldn't be back until the next day. This was during hurricane season, so him getting called into work wasn't too big of a surprise. Anyway, my dad had already left for work and I was laying on the couch watching a movie while somewhat enjoying the sound of rain and thunder from outside. At one point during the movie, I for some reason fell asleep and woke up to the sound of the home phone ringing. This wasn't too sketchy as we get calls almost every day, most of the time either from scammers or people looking for my dad through his work. I hesitated and got up to answer the phone and said hello, still in my drowsy state. However, the only thing I heard was a slight static from the other end of the line. The rest was just silence. Just as I was about to hang up the phone, I then heard what sounded like faint crying. I said hello one more time into the phone, and this time I got a response. There was a girl on the other end that sounded around 5 or 6 judging by her voice. She sounded distressed and scared. Then, clear as day, I heard these exact words. "Help me. I've been missing for 3 years." I told her to stay on the line with me and then I dialed 911 from my iPhone. All I told the operator was just to listen. I asked the girl where she was located, but with her being so young she could only describe the house to be small and white. She explained that she was in a dark room left alone. All of a sudden, the sound of a door opening with force broke the silence and the girl began to scream before hanging up. The operator took down every little detail she tried giving us and thanked me for informing her. All the while, I was texting my dad about the situation and he told me to stay calm and call the cops again and give our address for further explanation. The cops did end up coming to my house and I was being questioned for about half an hour before they finally left. The police never did find out who that little girl was or where she was calling from, as it would have been very difficult to trace, but they did all they could. My heart aches for that child, and I hope she's doing alright, but I still have my doubts about that. About 6 years ago, something happened to me while I was home alone that I'll never forget. Because of this, I had to get therapy for 5 months straight, and this is why I will never stay home alone again. I was 12 years old at the time of this story, and this took place in my hometown in Weymouth, Massachusetts. It's a very small town as there was nothing to do, and the antique design of the town made it look also boring and old. One weekend, my mom had told me that she had recently gotten a call back from a job that she applied to and that she had to go into Boston for an interview. She trusted me to watch over the house for a few hours while she was gone. With me being only 12, she went over the rules most parents tell their children when being left alone. Don't go outside, don't answer the door for anybody, etc. She then left in a hurry and I had the house to myself for a few hours until she got back. With nothing to really do or anywhere to go, I simply threw myself onto my bed and flipped on my TV to the cartoons. About an hour later, I go downstairs while on my way to the kitchen and I notice somebody standing in our backyard. He was facing off in the opposite direction with both of his hands in his pockets as if he were waiting for the bus. At first, I didn't get too worried as a few men had been coming by to fix a pipe on the side of the house that had a major leak. However, this guy looked nothing like a plumber or anyone who specializes in repairing pipes for that matter. He wore a black long-sleeved shirt, black pants, and a gray hoodie that surely covered most of his face. I don't even remember thinking twice about it. Anyway, I had went back upstairs and finished up my TV shows and decided to go take a shower as I had a birthday to go to later that night. I turn on the shower and go in for about 15 minutes. I take really long showers, so whenever I'm home alone, I go mental. After I was done, I turned off the water, and that's when I hear the front door open. My first thought was that it was my mom finally home from her interview, so I shoot her a text asking if she was home, and within a minute, she replies with, "Hey honey, I just got finished with the interview. I'm driving home now. Is everything okay?" That's when I get a sharp pain into the pit of my stomach, knowing that someone was in my house, and it wasn't my mom. Why my dad isn't home is another story, but I take a deep breath to compose myself and wrap a towel around me and slowly creep down the steps and try and see who it was. Looking back, that was probably the most stupidest decision of my life. As I reached the bottom step, I peeked around the corner and felt my blood run cold. There was a man, about 6'6", and looked to be in his mid-30s, standing in my kitchen. He was holding a large wrench in his hand and was looking directly at me as if he knew I was coming down the stairs. Then, very quietly, he said 5 words that still haunt me till this day.
"Run while you still can."
That's when I lost it and started screaming while running up the stairs and into my room while locking the door. All the while, I began hearing footsteps coming up the stairs and stopping at my door. I knew he was there because I could see the outlines of his shoes at the bottom of the door frame. He began banging on the door loudly with a wrench, demanding me to let him in. At this point, calling the police wasn't an option, so I did the only thing I could do. I slowly opened my window and jumped out onto the patio floor. Even though I tried to break my fall, I still landed with some minor injuries. I felt as if 1,000 pounds had been lifted off of me when I see my mom's car pull into the driveway. I run crying to her, explaining the situation, and she immediately takes out her .45 she keeps in her purse and walks into the house. I'd like to mention that my mom had served 3 years in the military, so she knew what she was doing. I heard 2 very loud gunshots from inside my room, followed by yelling and screaming. Police had been called by my neighbors, who apparently had heard the gunshots, and police then took this nightmare guy away. The look the man gave me as he was forced into the backseat of the police car was something that I'd never forget. It was a look of pure hatred and anger, like the first thing he would do once he got out of jail would be to come back for me. We had since moved out of that house a month later due to the constant paranoia I was having, which eventually made me have mental therapy as previously mentioned before. I don't know what the man's intentions were, but if he had a wrench with him, chances are he was probably planning on doing a lot more than just robbing us.
This happened on my 23rd birthday. I'm now 45. I live in Michigan, and this happened early January. I was prepping for a night out with my girl and cleaning up since we normally have parties at my house. My son was home since I was dropping him off on our way out. He was 4 at the time, and I was a single mom. I went to take out my trash, and I'd left my door open a small crack since I was heading out soon. Big mistake. Keep in mind, this was not the best area. I had then heard my son say, "Mom, someone's here." That alone caught my attention, just his voice sounded odd. I looked, and I saw a man who had a mask on and a dark hoodie. He then yells, "I got a gun! Give me your money!" I had literally just got paid on this day, so my first thought was to distract him. My purse was in my dining room downstairs, but I told him it was upstairs. I lived in a townhouse at the time. He grabbed me by my shirt and ripped off my chain. Well, that pissed me off, and at this point I had not seen a gun, so I said, which looking back was a terrible idea. We fought, and he got some good blows on me, but so did I. My son was now screaming and crying at this point. My front door was still open, so I pushed him as hard as I could, and he literally went flying out the door down my front stairs. I then ran outside just screaming and yelling for help. A cop happened to drive by, and he asked what was going on, so I told him, and he took off. It was winter, so they tracked him down and caught him. He went to jail, but he didn't really do any serious time. He was released about a year later. I was walking into a grocery store when I had seen him. My heart stopped, and I immediately grabbed my son and walked out. I followed up with the court, and they claimed that they had sent me a notice, but I never got it. About 6 months later, he was on the front page of the local newspaper as he had killed someone, and he's now serving 55 years. If they would have put him away for what he did to my son and I, a life might have actually been saved. I do still check on him occasionally just to make sure he's still locked up. I was street smart, but this put me on edge for years. I would sleep with a knife in my front door until I met my husband, who finally allowed me to relax and trust again. I'm still so grateful to him. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to my story, and please stay safe. The story happened almost 15 years ago when I was about 4 years old, and although this occurred when I was quite young, the images from this experience are permanently planted in my mind, but a few of the details are hazy. Now, to give some background, my family and I lived in a nice suburban neighborhood about an hour outside of Chicago. On this particular day, I would be in the care of my then 15-year-old sister and her best friend, while my mother would be running the store. She gave us the normal safety talk and made it clear we were to not go outside. She then departed to the store, and my sister and her friend, not even 5 minutes later, suggested we go on a walk around the neighborhood. I remember distinctly my sister then opening the garage door, seating me in my bright pink kid's Jeep, and we began our walk around the neighborhood. We lived in a cul-de-sac and primarily retired community kind of neighborhood. We began going around the block, my sister and her friend having a blast and rebellious behavior as they saw it. Now, I remember that we then turned the street and continued through the neighborhood. We made it about a quarter up the street, when we then saw an older woman walking towards us about a football field length in front of us. We all stopped dead in our tracks. She was wearing a long tan coat. My sister and friend gave each other a look, and we sat stagnant there in place. The woman then being ahead of us held all three of our young girls' attention. After only a few seconds since noticing her, she then realized that we saw her in turn. Within less than a minute of catching her gaze, she then began charging us, yelling at us down the sidewalk. My sister grabbed my pink Jeep and her friend, and then held me in her arms as we ran through backyards being chased by this woman. We made it to our backyard, and we ran inside our back French doors as quickly as we could, immediately locking the set as we scrambled inside. We then heard a bang. We all then turned to see a large man, tall, broad shoulders and built, leaning against the back door staring at us, looking upset that we had locked the door. This is the point in time that my memory turns hazy. I don't really remember what happened after, but I do remember my sister calling the cops and my mom returning home and scolding my sister and her friend for calling the cops, saying they were teenage girls and just liked to start drama. This happened over a decade ago, and we to this day never know what happened to those two, as there were no arrests ever made. My sister and I are still close, yet we haven't talked about this experience in years. I can't forget the vivid memory I have of being chased and genuinely thinking we were doomed if that door hadn't been locked just in time. Dear God, was that a terrifying experience. My friends and I decided to have a sleepover at my house since my parents were gone. This story took place over 10 years ago. My mom told me she would be going to Mexico to visit some family members that were sick. She wanted me to stay and feed and take care of the dogs, so I agreed. She told me she would be leaving Friday night and would most likely be back on Monday. Since I was 14 at the time, of course I was happy to have the house free of adults even for a few days. On Friday she left me money and she told me she ordered a pizza and to tip the driver. She left it around 6 and the pizza got there around 7. I tipped the driver and he left. Around 8 p.m. I decided to call my friends to see if they were trying to hang out, as I didn't want to be by myself that whole weekend. My friends, who we'll call Omar and Lewis, had agreed. We all kind of lived in the same neighborhood, so they had biked to my house. They got there around 8:30 and we were just playing 2K and Call of Duty together, like most teenagers do. We had stopped playing around 11 and we were getting kind of bored, so we had watched a scary movie. I had told them to pick a movie while I went and put some popcorn in the microwave. While I was putting the popcorn in the microwave, I had heard a big bang in my backyard, like something hit our fence. Now, my kitchen is at the back of the house, and there's 2 big windows in the back, so if something was there, it for sure would have seen me. I thought it was probably my dogs just in the backyard, so I just shrugged it off and we watched the movie. Mid-movie, we then hear knocking at my front door. This startles us, so I decided to go see who it was. Well, I go to the door, and I see a girl no older than 19, and she starts banging on my door telling me to open it. I then hear her asking for help, saying to open the door and that something's after her. As you can all imagine, my friends and I are scared shitless right now. Lewis decides to run over to open the door to help her, but when he does, she pushes the door open and knocks him down, and then 2 other guys come right in behind her. When this happened, I knew right then that they were going to rob us. That's when Omar and I run up the stairs, which was probably the dumbest thing we could have done. Lewis got up there quickly and had followed us, and the girl followed us too. The 2 guys stayed and tried to steal anything they saw, including my Xbox. Omar and I ran up to the attic, but Lewis was a little chubby, so he didn't quite make it, and he just ran into my room and then put his body against the door. Luckily, the girl didn't see us run into the attic, but I think she did see Lewis run into the room, so she probably assumed we were in there too. She was pounding on the door when suddenly Lewis just opened it and then tackled her. Lewis then started jumping on her, and that's when Omar and I decided to join in. I had started to yell that I called the cops and they're on the way. The guys run out, and then Lewis gets off of her and she joins them. They ended up leaving, and we decided not to tell anyone what happened, as they really only stole the Xbox and nothing else. We couldn't really get any sleep for the rest of the night, but we were really happy that we scared them off. I'm really grateful that all of us ended up being okay, and that it didn't get worse than what it was. Last year, I moved to another city after finishing high school. I assessed several college options, and I decided on one that would have me move roughly 3 hours. I found an apartment where I would be able to live without roommates, and that was in a safe part of town with a reasonable rent. It was close to some attractions in the city, which was an added bonus to me, as it would still allow me to have a reasonable social life. For the first 4 months or so, it was great. There were absolutely no problems or safety concerns of any sort, and I managed to become good friends with a guy who studied at the same college as me. He coincidentally lived around 5 minutes away from me, so we would often hang out at each other's places. One night, just as winter started, he had called me over to play some video games and hang out. We had a pretty chill night, drank a few beers and had a few good laughs and enjoyed ourselves. At around 1 a.m., we decided to call it a wrap, and I headed home to my apartment. When I got back home, I decided to head out to the balcony that overlooked the entrance of my building to go smoke a cigarette. I vividly remember looking around and seeing absolutely nobody. It was a cold winter night, and it wasn't the weekend, so understandably everybody was at home. Besides the usual car or 2 passing by, it was dead quiet. Once I finished my cigarette, I decided to call it a night and get ready for bed. I was understandably confused when I had heard a short ring on my doorbell. I stood in the center of my room for a solid few seconds as confusion and a little bit of fear then set in. I snapped out of it and decided to tiptoe to my door just to try and hear if anyone was outside. My immediate thought was that my friend came over to drop something off that I might have forgotten, but then I thought to myself that he would have texted me or called. I probably listened for half a minute or so when the person once again rang the doorbell and then softly knocked a few times. I was stood still and I didn't want to make a sound so that I wouldn't give away the fact that I was at the door. I heard the stranger pacing around the apartment for a few seconds before he then stopped. I then waited for any sort of noise, but it was quiet. That's when I decided to look at the peephole to see that he had left. I picked up the cover of the peephole and then took a look. My legs pretty much went numb as I saw a hooded figure looking straight into the peephole. He was holding the zipper of his hoodie so as to hide his face. All I could really make out was his forehead and eyes. He must have either heard me lift the cover or my heavy breathing, because right away he moved from the peephole and then said,
"I know you're at the door."
Now, by this point, I was pretty much shivering in fear, but I had mustered up the courage to then say, "I'm calling the cops, man." To which he then laughed and said,
"Yeah, sure thing, big guy."
He then proceeded to wipe away the door handle with his sleeve before then walking off. I understandably called the police. When they came over, they had actually informed me that I wasn't the only one. He had been doing this for at least a month, and they also suspected him of at least one home invasion where a father had to chase him out of the house. I crashed in my friend's house for around a week or so after this before I felt comfortable going back into my own apartment. It's been a year, and I haven't heard any new news about him. He could have been arrested by now, but as far as I know, he hasn't been. I find it more than likely that he simply just moved to a different area. I'm not sure if he had any violent intent or not, but either way, let's seriously never see each other again.
This happened 2 years ago, and it still puts me on edge thinking about it. My husband, myself, and our then 2-year-old daughter moved to Tennessee to get a fresh start on life. We were all exhausted after a long drive and just wanted to get out the mattresses. My parents, who lived in Tennessee already, were helping us unload. Naturally, all the neighbors in our apartment complex came out and said hi. That's when we met Ben. Right away, I got creepy vibes off of him. Our daughter, who to this day is way too friendly to strangers, hid behind my husband and visibly cringed. We made small talk, but mainly paid more attention to unloading our stuff than chatting with our new neighbors. My dad later told me that at one point, he came back to the truck and saw Ben staring at our daughter. My dad called him out, and when Ben denied it, my husband eventually told him to go Later that night, me and my husband were still going through our stuff. Our daughter was staying the night at my parents' house. It was about 10:30 p.m. when we heard a knock at the door. Thinking that it was the pizza that I ordered, my husband opened the door, and there stood Ben. He asked us if we needed any help. Him showing up at our door so late at night, even for a friendly neighbor, was just creepy. Before we could tell him to get lost, he demanded a cigarette. Not only was he a total weirdo, but now he was just being plain rude. Neither of us smoked, and when we told him, he got a bit pissed. He started yelling and screaming at my husband, and began pounding on the wall. This guy was unhinged. Thankfully, our landlord lived across the way from us at the time, and came out to tell him off. As Ben sauntered away, our landlord explained to us that Ben is the resident pest, and suffered from mental issues, but overall, was harmless as long as he took his meds. Yeah, because that's exactly what you want to hear on your first night in a new place. After that, life kind of fell into place, and we settled in without any further disruptions. We had crazy schedules and would sometimes work graveyard shifts. I would get home around midnight and would see Ben standing outside the apartment buildings. He would always seem to be staring at me. I would just ignore him, mainly because I was just too tired and wanted to get to bed. He would always ask me for cigarettes, and I kept telling him that I didn't smoke. My husband said that he did the same thing to him. We would change up our work times just to throw Ben off a little, and at first, it worked, but Ben started to pester us during the day. On our days off, we would take our kid to the park or the mountains. One time, Ben asked to come with us, said that he was great with kids, and that we could trust him alone with our daughter. I really should have just let my husband deck him in the face right then and there. When we came back, he was sitting in our parking spot, said that he was making sure no one parked in it. He then tried to hug our daughter, and she screamed and clung on to me for dear life. I took her into the house while my husband finally snapped and really gave the guy an earful, telling him just to leave us alone. We told the landlord, but they played the whole mental issues card. And look, I get it. Mental illness is never fun to deal with, but he was constantly harassing and terrifying my daughter, and we have a duty to protect our family. It got to the point where my daughter didn't want to go outside because the bad man would be out there and stare at her. We threatened to cut our lease if something wasn't done about it. I began talking to my other neighbors, and everyone seemed to have the same type of experience. One of my neighbors told me that he and another neighbor saw Ben staring at some of the young girls wearing bathing suits and short shorts by the community pool, and they chased him off. They reported this to the landlord, but nothing was ever done. After about a month, things had quieted down. Ben wasn't spotted outside anymore. In fact, no one really saw him. We figured he moved away or something. Good riddance. We were thinking about moving in with my folks, while we saved up the money for a real house. One night, I came home from work early. My husband was out of town because of work, and my parents had taken our daughter to visit some family. I decided to play Saints Row 4 and relax after working an 11-hour shift. I was deep into the game when someone knocked on the door. It was about 10 p.m. at this point. If anyone was coming over that late, they would have called or texted first. I got up to see who it was. Before I got to the door, the knob began to shake violently. Then I heard Ben screaming,
"Let me in! Open this goddamn door!"
The heavy knocking turned into him slamming his shoulder against the door. He was screaming like a deranged madman. I grabbed my phone, the sharpest knife that we had from the kitchen, and hid in the closet. Cliché, I know, but if he managed to get in, there would at least be some distance between us. I called 911, and they said that my other neighbors had called in as well. It was only after I heard the sirens stop and voices yelling outside that I felt safe to come out. I opened my door and saw a cop pinning Ben face down on the ground. The landlord was screaming at the cop to let him go, and he even shoved him. Both of them ended up being arrested. I gave my report, and each one of my neighbors backed up everything I said, and even added in their own experiences. My sweet church lady neighbor called my husband and parents to let them know what was going on, and she even let me stay with her and her family for the night. But after what happened, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept thinking that at any moment I would hear Ben's deranged screaming and pounding from outside. It turns out Ben was a registered sex offender. Rumor has it that the landlord was aware of it, but willingly overlooked it as Ben's family would slip him extra money as long as he was allowed to stay there. That's why nothing was ever done about his behavior. Makes me sick. Ben really did take meds, but had not been on any of them for the past few months. He tried to tell the cops that our daughter was his and that we kidnapped her, and that I was having an affair with him. Crazy, right? Last thing I heard, Ben was placed in some institution. I'm not sure if it was prison or a psych ward. The landlord was fired and pretty much chased out of town. Good riddance. We were offered 3 months rent-free for our trouble, but that was ultimately our breaking point. We sold off most of our belongings and moved in with my parents. I'm happy to say that we have a house now, and our daughter is not afraid to go outside anymore. And yes, we checked all of our neighbors for red dots.
This story takes place in the early 1990s. I was 10 or 11 at the time. My family and I lived in a rural area near Kansas City. This particular area nowadays is very different from what it was in the 90s. Back in the day, it was a very country-like atmosphere. The road that we lived on was a gravel road, and the traffic was very sporadic. Typically, the only people who drove down our road were people who lived on our street, and there were only a few houses on our street at the time. Across the street from the house that we moved into, there was a large cornfield with a few trees near the road. There were a few other boys my age who lived on our street, and we all thought it would be fun to build a treehouse or a fort of some kind. I was across the street nearly every day, and my friends would often walk to my house and then we would go across the street to play in the fort. Think of that scene in the 1990 TV miniseries of Stephen King's It, where the Losers Club was building that dam in the river outside Derry. Yep, it's just like that. One day, I was across the street with one of the other boys. We noticed that there was a small blue car that would drive up and down the street very slowly. Since our road was very narrow and gravelly, it was not unusual for people to drive kind of slow. But this car in particular was driving extremely slow. I noticed that the driver would look out of his window and just sort of eyeball me every time that he drove by. I saw him at least 2 or 3 times that afternoon, but at the time, I remember thinking that he probably either just was curious about our playhouse, or that he was lost and maybe contemplating about asking us for directions. After a while, my friend had to go home, so I was there all by myself. Not long after my friend had left, I saw that same blue car slowly coming down the street once again, but this time, he came to a stop. The driver just sat there and stared at me for a while. I got this uneasy feeling about him. I knew all about stranger danger, even at that age. I began to feel that something bad was going to happen. My dad's words echoed in my head. If a stranger tries to grab you, you run as fast as you can and you scream your head off. I started thinking about which direction I should take off to. I knew that if I ran in the opposite direction of the guy in the car, I would be running into a cornfield that was at least a mile wide in every direction. If I were to run towards my house, I would have to cross the street, meaning that I would have to go past the creepy guy in the car to get to my home. The situation terrified me. My heartbeat escalated as I tried to figure out what the hell I was going to do. While deciding which direction would give me the best chance of getting away, I noticed the man in the car reach down for something. I never did see what he was going for, but something told me that if I didn't start running at that moment, I would be history. I then saw the man open the car door just a crack. I knew my dad was home at the time, so I decided to make a break for it. I knew that I was going to have to cross the street and I would have to get past the man's car. I began running as fast as I could alongside the road in the opposite direction of where his car was facing. I could see out of the corner of my eye that the guy had closed his door. When I reached the road, the driver had put his car in reverse. If I had been a second slower, I wouldn't have made it. The trunk of his car barely missed me as I darted away from the street to my driveway. I began screaming as loud as I could while charging towards my house. My dad ran outside to meet me in the driveway. When I had turned around to show my dad the man in the car, he was gone. All I could see was the dust cloud coming off the gravel road as the mysterious man in his blue car sped out of there. That night, I had a nightmare. I was running down a seemingly endless gravel road. I was panting, sweating, terrified. I would look back and see that blue car getting closer and closer. I woke up my parents. Apparently, I had been yelling in my sleep. I had to sleep in their room for a while, but the night terrors eventually did stop. This was nearly 2 decades ago, but I still remember it very well. There is no doubt in my mind that the man in the blue car was the monsters that your parents tell you about when you're a kid. Had I not run off when I did, I would probably be nothing but a statistic today. I occasionally hear stories about kids who went missing in my area in the 90s, and I wonder if it has anything to do with that man in the blue car. I may never know for sure, but I understand now why my dad always told me to run and scream. I'll be instructing my own children someday to do the same.
My mother was 14 in 1986 when this happened. She lived in China at the time with her parents and younger brother. It was deep into winter when this occurred, and the temperature dropped into the negatives. Snow was falling in thick layers onto the ground. It was around 10 p.m. when my mother finished up her classes and by then it was dark. Bear in mind, in China it's normal for young students to walk home alone without a parent or guardian. About 10 minutes after getting off the bus, she began walking through this old marketplace to get to her apartment. The marketplace was completely quiet and deserted at this time of night. There was also no lampposts around, so it was hard for my mom to properly see where she was going. But she had traveled this route several times before, so she was familiar and knew her way back home. My mother had this feeling that someone was lurking in the darkness of the marketplace. She tried to shrug it off, but the apprehension persisted. She continued to hear her feet crunching on the white snow. But suddenly, she stopped, and as she did, she could hear a second pair of feet crunching the snow behind her. My mom panicked, but she continued forward and pretended that she hadn't heard anything. She thought it might have been another student making their way back to their living quarters. This thought made sense, but it didn't stop her from walking faster. As she began to pick up her pace, the crunching snow behind her also began to speed up. My mother couldn't handle the fear any longer and started running, but the thick snow made it difficult for her to run away quickly. She also gave a quick look behind her. She was greeted by the silhouette of a tall man only a few meters away and closing in. The man did not appear to be wearing a coat, despite the freezing temperature. The lack of lampposts made it difficult for my mom to make out anything else. However, that's not what scared my mom the most. She was eventually chased into an area that was lit by a dim light mounted to the side of a merchant stall. When she looked back, she was able to see that her pursuer was carrying a large plank in his hand. Now petrified, she continued to run and refused to look back again. Suddenly, she saw the light of a lamppost that was situated on a small street. Luckily that night, there happened to be a young couple walking towards her. With her last ounce of energy, my mom ran to them and collapsed. My mom was in hysterics when they asked her what was wrong. She explained to them what happened, but by then, the stranger had vanished. The couple that she ran into was living in the same apartment block as her and was familiar with her father. They accompanied her back home, and they told my grandfather where they found her. After the couple left, my mom couldn't stop crying out of shock and fear. From then on, my grandfather would meet my mom at the bus stop where she got off at, and they would walk home together. My mom never found out who her assailant was, and thankfully, she never had another encounter with him again. I was reading a story that reminded me of an event from over 20 years ago. It was around the second half of 1998. I had taken a security guard job at a plant that manufactured locks. I usually worked one of 3 shifts, 4 p.m. to 12 a.m., 7:30 p.m. to 3:30 a.m., 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. The 7:30-3:30 shift was for extra coverage, so there were always 2 of us from 7:30 to midnight. It was a very routine, boring job for the most part. We did our rounds, logged everything out of the ordinary, and watched a tiny monitor displaying the CCTV feed. Things went by in an almost peaceful manner. I worked, saved, bought a car, and had planned to move. By late March of 1999, I served my notice and prepared to head cross-country. A new hire was brought in to fill my spot, a soft-spoken man named Calvin. As part of his training, Calvin spent time working all 3 shifts. At night, he was a shadow, working by himself, getting a feel for the plant's nocturnal routines. Most nights he worked with myself and a female guard named Amira, who was around my age. I was 18 at the time. Calvin was about a decade or so older than us. He was quiet and polite, though something seemed to be missing. There's usually a spark that genuinely nice people seem to have, and it just wasn't there. Whenever he went on rounds with me, he would ask questions about the job and make small talk. I noticed that he was a bit odd. laughing at odd times and changing his tone mid-sentence. At the time, I chalked it up to him just being socially awkward, and that would pass. One night, near the end of his first week, he went on a round with Amira. When they returned to the office, I knew there was something wrong. Amira was normally very talkative, but she would barely say a word. I wasn't sure what happened. I waited until Calvin went to the restroom to ask. During their rounds, everything had been normal until they reached the brass mill. It's a section of the plant that shut down around 6 a.m. There were usually no employees there after that time, and there were no lights on. They were making their way to a checkpoint on a landing atop a flight of stairs when the mood shifted. Amira told me that she turned around only to find he was right on her. Startled, she backed against the grating at the end of the landing, and he leaned in towards her, his face nearly touching hers. He said something flirtatious to her in a very low voice. When she mentioned his wedding band, he said, "It's gonna be over soon." From then on, I did the rounds, taking Calvin with me each time. The night ended without further incident, and I left a note for our supervisor detailing what happened. The next night came and went, with no Calvin. I did the rounds while Amira stayed in the office. On my second to last shift, I came in to find Amira freaking out. She found out why Calvin hadn't been at work. Apparently he had been arrested for murdering his wife. She had been dismembered and burned. Parts of her body had been placed in a pond less than a mile from where we worked. That night and the next, Amira called the jail just to make sure that they were still holding him. Based on the time frame, he had killed his wife months before he even started that job. There is an article linked below. This story didn't happen to me personally. It happened to two of my cousins. They gave me permission to share this story, so I will be telling it from their perspective. My name is Leah. This story happened in April of 2016. I was 29 years old at the time. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. In April, my cousin and I, who I'll refer to as Kate, wanted to go for a Caribbean getaway, but we didn't want to go to the popular tourist destinations, such as the Bahamas, Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, or Puerto Rico. So we chose a lesser-known island called Dominica. It's a small island located between Guadeloupe and Martinique, with a population of about 72,000. We booked an Airbnb in the countryside, about 30 minutes away from the capital city. The first 2 weeks went well. We rented a car, and the Airbnb was perfect as it was located near a beach. It was the getaway that we needed. We explored the island, visited several waterfall locations, and even made some friends in the village we were staying at. But on the second day of the third week, something horrible happened. One afternoon, we didn't go out and decided just to spend time at the nearby beach with the locals. Later on, when the people left the beach to go home, Kate wanted to go back to the Airbnb, but I decided to stay there a while longer so I could have some alone time. I closed my eyes and laid down near the beach, enjoying the peace and quiet. I must have dozed off because before I knew it, it was dark, so I decided it was a good time to head back. I arrived at the Airbnb, but as I was getting my keys to unlock the door, two men wearing masks came out of the bushes and started beating me with batons. One even threw a rock at me while I was down, causing me to scream in pain. Kate came out and tried to defend me, but the men also overpowered her. They ran into the Airbnb and ransacked the entire place. Some nearby villagers saw what was happening and quickly came to our aid, But by that time, the two men had already fled. They had taken my laptop, my phone, and my wallet. Luckily for us, our passports weren't stolen. We were both bleeding pretty badly. At some point, I felt like I was going to pass out. The police eventually showed up, and after receiving some medical assistance, we told them what happened. They were shocked. Dominica is usually a pretty safe country. Two of the villagers drove us to the hospital, which was located in the capital city of Roseau. We had to stay in the hospital for a while because our injuries were so bad. We even had to change our return flight. Thankfully, we got out alive. As far as I know, the two perpetrators who attacked us were never caught. This event has forever traumatized Kate and I. However, I still like Dominica, and would love to go visit there again someday. But next time, I'll be a lot more cautious. This happened after a long and boring day at school. While returning back to my house, I was pretty excited, as it was a Friday, which meant no school the next day. While approaching my house, I noticed that our garage door was left open and the lights were on. My dad had left for a business trip that same day, and I figured that he must have left in a hurry and had forgotten to close the door. I didn't give it much thought and switched off the lights and closed the garage door. I played some video games and watched a movie. My mom had to go to her friend's house for whatever reason, so I had the house all to myself, and it was nighttime. I went to the kitchen to make myself a drink, and I saw that the garage lights were switched on again. I figured my mother must have gone in there for some reason and had left the lights on, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake this unsettling feeling that something was wrong. I went into the garage again, and right away, I saw that every drawer in my dad's workshop area had been opened, and many of his tools were laying around. Whoever was in his garage was surely looking for something. I figured that it had to have been my mom, but when she briefly stopped by the house earlier that evening, I didn't notice her going to the garage, and she wasn't there for very long either. I was honestly creeped the hell out by this point. I didn't see anybody else in the garage, so I went back into my house, making sure to lock the door behind me. As I was watching TV, from behind me, I heard the knob on the door that led into the garage start to violently rattle. In a panic, I got up from the couch and stared in horror at the door. After the person on the other side failed to open it, they let out a loud scream and began to viciously pound on the door. I quickly ran upstairs to grab my cell phone, and then I got it into my head that I needed to exit the house before calling the police. I guess with all the adrenaline running through my body, I didn't notice that all the loud bashing noises from downstairs had come to a stop. Upon coming back down, I immediately made for the front door, which I had to go through the living room to get to. Looking back, I probably should have went through the back. I was very lucky, because when I entered the living room, I saw the intruder. He was a very big man and had an axe in his hands, which he had taken from my dad's workshop. The man had his back to me and appeared to be looking behind an armchair in the far corner of the living room. I'm guessing that the TV, which was still playing the movie, masked my footsteps as I entered the room. I didn't go back upstairs. That would have been stupid. I turned around and hastily made my way to the back door. After running a short distance, I called the cops and reported the incident. They informed me that they would be there in 5 minutes. I then went to my neighbor's house, who was a really good friend of my father's, and waited there until the cops showed up. To make a long story short, the police searched the whole house, and just as I feared, the man was nowhere to be found. They discovered that the intruder had smashed through the door in the garage with the axe. It was kind of a flimsy door, and it would have taken him a few good swings to break through it. I called my mom, and she came back as soon as possible. After she heard about the incident, she hugged me and was grateful that nothing had happened to me. I honestly don't know if my dad had forgotten to close the garage door, or if the intruder somehow opened it. But regardless, whenever you leave your house, always double check to make sure your doors are locked and secured, because it's a scary world we live in. A little background information to set the scene. I live in a house that is directly across the street from a cul-de-sac. Beyond the cul-de-sac is the entrance to a forest that stretches on for miles. The woods are pretty dense in terms of trees and bushes. When I was younger, I would love to ride my bike or scooter down various pathways through the forest and back to my house. Since it was a short distance, there was a bit of a downhill slope. One day when I was maybe 7 or 8 years old, I was riding my bike down the street that led to the cul-de-sac. There was multiple openings at the end of the cul-de-sac where you could clearly see the forest from the street. I was distracted by someone standing in the woods off in the distance. I wasn't paying attention, and I accidentally ran into a small car that was parked outside one of the houses. It was kind of embarrassing, but thankfully I wasn't injured or anything. The person began pacing back and forth frantically, like they were trying to decide on something. It was then that I noticed that this person was wearing what looked like a black raincoat. He didn't have his hood up, so I could clearly see his head. He was a balding middle-aged man. And I'm not entirely sure, but I think he was talking to himself. I was a bit weirded out, so I hid behind the car that I ran into and lifted my head just high enough over the trunk so I could still see what was happening. It was then that I saw something in his hand that seemed to give off a bright shine every time he walked under a ray of light coming through one of the overhead trees. It was a knife, and from where I was, I could see that the knife appeared to be stained red. I gathered up my bike and was about to head straight back to my house. When I looked back to where the dude was, I froze. The man had stopped pacing and was now staring right at me. I panicked and dropped down behind the car, letting go of my bike, which made a loud metallic clank as it collided with the street. Not knowing what to do, I waited for about 30 seconds before peeking my head back out from behind the car. The person was still standing there, just staring. Then suddenly, the person started sprinting towards me, letting out a deranged scream, followed by something that I will never forget as long as I live. I launched myself back onto my bike and started pedaling home as fast as I could. When I made it to the end of the street, I turned back and saw the psycho walking back into the woods. When I got back home for dinner, I didn't say anything about it to my parents or my sister. I was afraid that they wouldn't let me ride down the cul-de-sac anymore. I guess being a dumb kid, that was more important than my own safety. It's been about 10 years, and we still live in the same house, and haven't heard about any kidnappings or murders happening around here in the past decade. So I'm not entirely sure what that person was doing out there. Maybe he was just some mentally unhinged nutcase off his meds. Maybe he was a crazed drug addict. Whatever the case may be, I'm glad I didn't meet him and his knife up close and personal. I used to date this guy named Jake. I met him through mutual friends, and at first things were okay between us. But there was something about him that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Jake seemed to just kind of show up around places where I would be, without any kind of setup. This happened to me more than a few times, mind you. It was like I was being stalked by my own boyfriend. He gave off this weird vibe that would have been assigned to anyone not to date this person. But to be honest, I wasn't in a very good place in my life at the time. I was very depressed, had a bit of a drug problem, and had very low self-esteem. He knew that, so when he pursued me, I went with it. We ended up dating for about 2 years. About halfway into the relationship, he went to jail, and I ended up having to move in with my parents. When I would make the 2-hour drive to visit him, I began to notice that his personality took a turn for the worst. He became very possessive, and noticeably more uncomfortable in his own skin. The times I couldn't be there, since I always couldn't make that drive to see him, seemed to push him closer and closer to his breaking point. I think something happened to him while he was in jail. When he finally got out, I eventually moved back in with him, and that's when he took a nosedive into hard drugs. One night we had some people over at the house, and he was really overdoing it, if you know what I mean. He kind of went off into his own world. Even when our friends left, he really didn't seem to notice or care. I went upstairs to go to sleep, while he stayed downstairs. I laid down in the bed, and shortly after, I fell asleep. Suddenly, my entire body was shaking. I opened my eyes to see Jake violently shaking me. I looked at him, and I immediately became terrified. His eyes were bloodshot and crazed, and he was panting like some kind of rabid dog. "Where is it?" he barked. I asked him what he was talking about, and he seemed angered by this. "Where is it?" he asked again more aggressively. At this point, my initial fear had passed, and I then became very annoyed at the situation. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about, and then I rolled over in bed and tried to go back to sleep. He went back downstairs, and the next thing I know, I hear glass smashing and things being thrown around. I get up to see what's going on, and he comes barreling up the stairs and shoves me to the ground, coming down on top of me and pinning me to the floor. Mind you, I'm only 5'5", 130 pounds, and he's 6'4", almost 200 pounds. I had my phone in my hand, and he pried it away from me. At this point, I'm now horrified all over again. It was like something alien had taken him over. He was looking at me like how a lion stares down their prey. He looked into my eyes, and after a long silence, he said, "Don't tell anyone. Your phone. They can track it. Everyone knows you're here. They can't know you're here." At this point, I start struggling, trying to get away from him. He grips me harder and says 3 words I'll never forget. "I killed someone." After a few seconds, he suddenly lets go of me, bursts into tears, and runs away. I put on some clothes and book it out of the house, running as fast as I could to my car. When I got in and turned the key, I glance over to see him running straight at me. I scream, and before I could put my car into reverse and back out of the driveway, he forced open the hood of my car and pulled something out of the engine. At this point, I realized that I had left my phone in the house. Once he had got done tampering with my car's engine, he shut the hood and left, taking whatever he had pulled out with him inside. I sat there in the car, unsure of what to do. I could see him through the downstairs window. He was looking all around for God knows what. He was so focused on keeping me there and finding whatever he was looking for. As I sat in the car, I started sobbing. The car was still running, but I don't know what he pulled out of it. I didn't want to drive away and have the car break down, so I decided to make a run for it. The neighbors were close by, and all I had to do was make it to next door quickly. I waited for him to be out of sight. I then opened the car door and bolted. As I was running, I heard the sound of shoes on pavement from behind me. I turn, and I see him chasing me. His bloodshot eyes were fixated on me. I was now screaming for my life. I ran to the neighbors and beat on the door. When they opened it, I rushed inside and locked the door behind me. I then braced myself for Jake to slam into the door, but he didn't. I looked out the peephole, and he was nowhere in sight. The neighbors let me use their phone, and I called my parents to come get me. I left my belongings and my phone at Jake's place, and technically the car that I was using was in his name, so I left that there too. I have never spoken to him again. I shudder when I think about his bloodshot eyes staring me down, and the way he chased me down that day. That was the wake-up call I needed to get my together. I called the police and told them what he had said to me, but I never heard any follow-up. I figured that it might have been just the drugs talking, but if I had stayed with him, there's no telling what could have happened to me. My family planned a summer trip to visit my aunt and younger cousin Fred, who was 13 at the time. My aunt's house is a quiet country home surrounded by fields and dirt roads. There were porches on both the front and back of the house, making it look authentically country. Even though we were surrounded by the beauty of the countryside, it didn't take long for Fred and I to become bored. The sun was beginning to go down, the light was dimming, and the temperature was perfect for a stroll. Fred and I decided to take this time as an invitation to sneak out through the field behind the house. The field ended into a dirt road. We walked less than a half a mile, and we could see the dim lights at the parking lot of a small canning factory. By the way it smelled, I figured they probably canned boiled peanuts. We actually walked up to the back of the plant, where they parked delivery trucks for the night. The trucks are the type that have double doors on the back of them, and you only have to open one side to get in. Fred walked up to the back of one of the parked trucks and pulled on the door, and surprisingly, it was unlocked. We climbed right into the back. It was dark and empty. I shut the second door behind us, but I didn't close it all the way, leaving a small crack for a tiny bit of light to come through. Lucky for us, I had my cell phone with me, and I could use the flashlight. Of course, like every idiot teenager, we thought it would be cool to graffiti our own initials on the back of the truck. After we had our fun, and as we were just about to exit the truck, Fred caught the glimpse of someone through the opening in the door. He stopped in his tracks and became totally frozen, giving me a chance to look as well. I could see that a figure was walking across the parking lot opposite the truck. I thought this could have been a security guard. Fred started freaking out and hyperventilating. The man must have heard him because in that moment, he turned around and started walking in our direction. I put my hand over Fred's mouth and we both crouched down against the closed door. My head was flat against the door, with one eye looking through the slight opening. The man was now standing right outside the crack between the doors, only mere feet from us. How in the world he never opened the door, I'll never know. He was looking right through the opening in the door. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I could see his nasty, rotten teeth as he opened his mouth and coughed. Unbelievably, he never touched the doors. He just turned around and started walking towards the entrance of the plant. That's when we made a break for it. With a loud thump, my cousin's feet hit the asphalt. Before I jumped down, we both saw the creepy man standing at a short distance. He was wearing a black hoodie and ripped jeans. There was a large scar on his face from his mouth to his right eye, and I could see his broken teeth twisted into a grin. His appearance was so unsettling that I still have never forgotten about it to this day. I leapt down to the ground from the back of the truck, and that's when the man pulled out a knife. Before I could even get the word "run" out of my mouth, Fred was out of there like a bat out of hell. I truly didn't know Fred could sprint that fast as he left me behind. I then booked it, and the man took off after me. I could hear him growling and yelling profanities at us from behind me. We made our way into the fields, and it wasn't long before I could see the lights of my aunt's house in the distance. I took one last look behind me, and all I could see was a dark hooded figure standing among the tall blades of grass, watching us flee. And even though it had become considerably darker, I swear I could see the man's deranged smile from under his hood. I made it to the back of the porch alongside Fred, who was gasping for breath. We told our family everything that happened, leaving out the part about us being in the back of the truck, for obvious reasons. My aunt called the police, and after about half an hour an officer came. They found the man. It turns out he was a former employee of the factory who had been let go because of his severe mental issues. Ever since then, I never go out after dark unarmed. Who knows what would have happened if that lunatic had opened up those doors and found us. Back in the spring of 1999, when I was 16, my family moved to a small mountain town in Colorado. I quickly became friends with the only other kid my age who lived nearby. His name was Kyle. One evening, shortly before the start of summer, Kyle and I had been wandering through the woods and found a narrow river that flowed across the property. Being bored kids, our immediate reaction was to jump in and swim upstream and have fun. We kept at it until sundown. But instead of packing it in, set them down on the riverbank and keep swimming. After maybe another 10 minutes, Kyle became very quiet and gestured for me to swim closer to him. When I was within arm's reach, he whispered to me, "Look over my shoulder, towards the tree line. I think someone is there pacing back and forth." I would have immediately dismissed his words as just him jumping at shadows, but the genuine concern in his voice made me pause. I glanced over to where he had indicated and scanned the tree line for a few wary seconds, but didn't notice anything moving. I said something to the effect of, "It's either an animal or just shadows, dude. No one has any business being on this property, and I doubt anyone else knows about this section of river." That didn't seem to put Kyle's mind at ease at all. He turned back around and looked towards the tree line again, and for a moment, there was complete silence. "Did you just hear that?" Kyle asked. I told him that I didn't hear anything. Kyle asked if I would walk up to the bank with him and investigate to see if there was anything there. I told him if we got out, we wouldn't want to go back in, and I kinda wanted to swim some more. Kyle didn't respond, but instead swam out towards the bank and climbed out of the water. I continued to swim like a moronic kid, oblivious to the notion that me diving forward into the water in the dark could have resulted in me caving my head in on a hidden rock or something. I'm not sure how much time passed before I suddenly began to feel very alone. I turned back towards the bank, and I didn't see Kyle anywhere. Both of the flashlights were still untouched, lying in the sand by our shoes. I called out for Kyle as I climbed out of the water, but he didn't seem to respond. I picked up my flashlight and scanned the trees with the beam. I called out for Kyle again, half convinced that he was just messing with me. But again, silence was the only response. I took a few careful steps into the woods, around the area that Kyle had pointed out earlier. I was getting ready to call his name out again, when I noticed him. He was standing facing away from me several yards away, staring deeper into the forest. I walked over to him, but he didn't turn towards me as I moved closer. I shouted something along the lines of, "Kyle, why aren't you answering me?" I reached out to grab his shoulder, but before I could, he slowly raised one hand and pointed a trembling finger towards the shadows. "Can you see that? What is that?" I shined the flashlight at his face. I could see that he was bone white, and his eyes were as wide as sewer covers. I barely noticed it at the time, but one detail I'll never be able to forget was a single droplet of blood running down from his nose. I turned the light in the direction that he was pointing and asked, "What?" It was like time had stopped. My flashlight beam caught a pair of legs in dark pants, and I felt my heart skip a beat. The flashlight felt extremely heavy in that moment, and if I were in any other circumstances, I would have snapped the beam light upwards immediately. But all I could do was slowly raise my arm, as if I was fighting gravity itself. The legs simply kept going, then the torso appeared. When my flashlight traveled all the way up past its chin, it had a very wide and gummy smile. It was the scariest face I had ever seen. I flipped my and dropped my flashlight. I collided with Kyle as I turned, and we both hit the ground. I screamed for him to run. Then I took off like a maniac back down the river and back at the path we had taken, abandoning everything else, including my friend. I lost count of how many times I tripped. It was at least 6, maybe as many as 10. But I continued to leap back to my feet and kept sprinting, using only the starlight through the overhead branches and the distant glow of indoor lights where my house was to navigate. I didn't say anything to Kyle. I was certain that I could hear him only a few steps behind me, crashing around the sticks just as loudly as I was. I shot through the garage door into the kitchen, screaming bloody murder. My arms and face were bruised and bloody, and at some point, I had lost one of my sneakers. But I barely registered that as I cried for my parents to call the police. I looked around behind me for Kyle, but he wasn't there. Assuming that he had run back to his own house, I asked my parents to call his parents after the police arrived. I was shaking so badly when the cops came, and they seemed concerned that I might have been overdosing on something. Then we got the phone call from Kyle's parents, and they were checking to see if Kyle had come home with me. And the police called in a team of dogs and extra men to scan the area. They located our belongings by the river, but they found no trace of Kyle or the stranger. The search lasted months, and over 100 miles worth of forest was searched, but no trace of him was ever found. To this day, Kyle has never been seen again. There was media coverage at the time, but given that we were in a small town where people get lost in the woods often, I don't know how far the story spread. What is probably the most heartbreaking is that Kyle's family is still without any answers. I live with the guilt of his disappearance every day. I doubt that I'll ever forgive myself for not stopping to make sure that he was behind me. To this day, I'm sure I can recall the sound of his footsteps behind me as I ran, so I don't know at what point he stopped, or if the thing grabbed him. Another thought has crossed my mind numerous times. What if it wasn't Kyle that I heard behind me?
A couple of summers ago, I was having some serious car problems. At the time, I was going through all kinds of other crap. My boyfriend and I had just broken up. My savings were depleted. I was caught up in some drama at the place that I was working. In the middle of all this hectic time, my car starts acting funny, shaking whenever it started, blowing clouds out of the exhaust, the dashboard throwing codes and check engine lights. Pretty much everything that could go wrong seemed to be happening to my car all at once. Here's the deal. I know absolutely nothing about cars, and you can say it's because I'm a girl, but even if I were a guy, I still probably wouldn't know anything. I don't really care about cars. I don't care about understanding them. I'm more than happy to pay someone to do all that work. Back then though, especially being newly on my own, I had very little in the way of disposable income. So when the car started chugging and rattling, it had me sweating right away. If it was anything major, I would be out of a car because there's no way I could afford it. One of my friends made a suggestion to me, and that was to find a local mechanic online to just run simple diagnostics, locate the problem, and maybe work out a more feasible solution, depending on what it would cost me. My friend had just recently needed to get some work done, went through a guy advertising on Facebook, and not only did he fix everything wrong with their car, but he was totally transparent about the cost. The guy had since booked up and wouldn't be able to help me out for at least 3 weeks or maybe even more. My car was getting worse and worse every time I started it. I got to work finding someone else online, and I started with Craigslist, but quickly found out I didn't like how just anonymous it was. I threw up a post and got dozens of responses within a day, but none of them had anything to do with fixing my car. It mostly was just a lot of unsolicited pictures and offers for dates and other kind of weird stuff. I scrapped that post within 24 hours, and from there, ventured out into the world of Facebook Marketplace. This seemed to be way safer off of the jump. People could see my post, see what I was looking for, and the people that responded also had a name and a face. Half the people that I commented on I recognized from somewhere around town. They said they'd keep an eye out for an affordable mechanic for me. By that Friday, I got a message from a guy named Simon, and this guy seemed pretty legit. His profile was a few years old, wasn't covered in over-sexually posts or political propaganda. He seemed normal, and his account had a long history of doing mechanic work. Lots of photos of him working on cars in garages, wearing jumpsuits in the shop, that kind of thing. Simon seemed legit from top to bottom, and with the situation that I was in, it was all I was really looking for. Through DMs, I learned that Simon was branching out into his own self-employment and was doing all his own work. He had worked for a major dealership in town and then worked for a couple of shops after that, was fully insured and certified. This was music to my ears, all the exact stuff that I wanted to hear. Simon said he had one job where he's finishing up and that I would be next in line. We exchanged phone numbers and I started saving all the cash that I could. I was anxious, but things were finally looking up. I didn't really know what to expect cost-wise though, but I knew this was the best option and the one that I could most likely afford. I let my worry take the back seat and then tried to focus on things that I actually had control over, like my mood and how I performed at work. I scraped together a little extra cash, had a couple of good nights out, and just relaxed. Things were good, and if I let them, maybe they'd become great. Sure enough, I get a call a full day earlier than I was expecting. Simon was ready for me. He'd finish up with his last customer. The fix was easier than he first diagnosed, and the car was back on the road. Again, more music to my ears. I was starting to write all my problems off at this point, like a true sucker, until you get something in writing, or even better, and see the work with your own eyes. Never take anyone at their own word. That's how all of these marketplace websites work, and it makes for a very deep headache. We exchanged information, and I gave him every little detail that I could about my car. The normal stuff like the year, the make, the model, and symptoms of the issues that I was having, that kind of thing. He gave me the address to his garage and the time that I should arrived. Everything felt professional for a guy that I just found online, so I was even more enthralled with getting it all done and finally over with. I told Simon thank you so much for your time and that I would see him tomorrow. The address that he gave me was about a half hour away, on the side of town that I wasn't super familiar with. He told me to be there by 10 a.m., and I didn't want to be late, so I planned on leaving at 9. That never happened though. I woke to my phone buzzing around 5 in the morning. It was Simon. He said that his day had been thrown off schedule because he had an appointment later on in that day that he forgot about. He didn't want to leave me hanging. He asked if there would be any way possible that I could bring the car to him now, so he could at least take a look. I didn't work today, was already awake, and plus I just needed this to happen already. I told him I would be there as soon as possible. He sounded super excited, said goodbye, and I started getting ready. I blasted through a shower, pulled some clothes on, and scarfed down this microwavable breakfast, and then I hit the road. I don't even think the sun was up yet. I coasted along until I didn't know the roads anymore, and it wasn't until I went past that last stoplight that I realized I wasn't even in a neighborhood anymore. There were still houses out here, but there were big empty lots, full of grass between them. Still, even with the dwindling civilization around me, I didn't think twice about it. At some point, I reached over to grab my phone, check my messages, and change the song playing throughout my speakers. The second that I picked it up though, I get this incoming call from Simon, so I answered it right away. I put the phone to my ear as I prepared to say hello. I could hear Simon talking to someone else though. He sounded weird. It was his voice, but he was talking in a totally different manner. Not professional, or street if anything, if you get what I mean. Nah, she'll be here soon, he explained to someone, who sounded just as weird. Shh, I'm calling her. Then they both got quiet. Hello? I said into the phone. Jody? Simon asked, back to normal voice. Yeah, is everything okay? I asked. Yeah, I was just making sure you weren't having any trouble finding a place. I know it's kind of out there, he said. No worries, I'm on my way. I think I'm 15 minutes out, I said. Do you have another mechanic with you today? I asked. He kind of stammered a bit and said, No, why? Oh, I thought I heard you talking to someone when I first picked up, I explained. Must have been the radio or something, he said. Just checking to make sure you weren't lost. How far out is it? I asked. The map said it's not too far off the main road. You'll see, the address that I gave you is just for the driveway. You'll have to drive about a half mile to get back into the shop, he explained. I was starting to get a little nervous now. He didn't mention that it was in the middle of nowhere, or that I would have to drive off-road. My car was already having problems. Bouncing around the country road sounded like the best way to make those problems worse. Still, I'd come this far. I still had hope that Simon was going to be my guy to get me through this and get it fixed. He could hear the apprehension in my voice and went right to saying all the stuff that I wanted to hear. How we checked the engine, make sure everything's flushed, and it perked me right up and got me on my way. I said bye and hung up the phone. I'd caught him lying though, a skill that I picked up during my breakup earlier that summer. He walked right into it, and I couldn't tell why. Who'd he have with him that he didn't want me to know about? The road came up and I turned into what was a big dusty turnout along the road. From there, it was a little single rut dirt road that snaked off into the forest. My gut sank almost immediately. This was clearly not a road that led to a residence or business of any kind. There might be campsites back there, at the very most, and if not, piles of highway trash and shooting targets. I rolled my car through the lot and then onto that dirt road, and bumped along for maybe 5 minutes, then brought my car to a stop. Even with the rising sunlight, there was nothing out here. No light in the distance, no big warehouse, no shop doors, nothing. I grabbed my phone and called Simon. Hello? He said. Hey, I don't see anything out here, like at all. How far did you say it was? I asked, knowing he had already said it a half a mile off the main road. Oh, about a half a mile. Well, I've already gone that far. I've been driving for a few minutes now, I interrupted him. Oh, well, you're almost here then. I don't log distance well. It might be further than a half mile, 2 miles maybe, but it has to be 2 miles at the most, he explained. My gut kept twisting into a knot. Things were starting to not add up, and I was feeling a fool for being out in the woods at 5 in the morning. Unbelievably, I kept pressing on. tapping my gas pedal and daring my car to break down at any damn moment. I go just a little bit further when my phone lights up. It's Simon calling again. I answer and bring my car to a slow roll. "Hey, I can see your headlights," he exclaims. I feel a bit of confidence for just a split second, but then I remember the string of buzzwords that he used to get me out here. I'm realizing this guy has to be a bullshit, and a supremely good one at that. Anytime I expressed any kind of doubt, he started saying all the positive stuff that I needed to hear, and I just take him at his word from there. "Yeah, just keep going, just back through this tree line and you're here." "Why is your shop out here, Simon?" I just asked him point blank. "Oh, you know, he started. "There is no shop, is there?" I asked in a measured tone. I was just gauging his reaction at this point to see how much of what he was saying was a lie. Then he did something unexpected. He hung up on me. I looked down in disbelief, scoffed, then froze. Shadows flickered up ahead, just beyond my headlights. I slowly looked up, and to my horror, 2, maybe 3 people were skulking through the tall grass, coming right at me. I screamed and hit the lock button, which was a relief, but I really needed to actually leave. I was panicking and wasting time. I grabbed my shift knob and slid it into reverse. Nothing happened. I could actually feel that nothing happened within transmission, or anywhere for that matter. When I hit the gas, the car still went forward. Not good. I shifted into reverse and it set, and then I shifted back into reverse. Nothing still. I shifted back into drive. Still nothing. My eyes slowly split wide open as I realized I was stuck in neutral. The car problems I was having were about to get me murdered. I continued playing with the stick, played with the pedal, but nothing was working. The engine revved, but one of the gauges just spun circles. Everything else was totally still. Everything but those phantoms beyond the windshield. There were definitely 3 of them, and they fanned out and closed in at a sickening pace. I could feel bile steaming up my throat from my anxiety, from my desperation that led me out there, and tears began blurring my vision, but I knew the car was my only hope. I kept playing with the stick until it clicked. The car dumped into reverse and suddenly I was rolling backwards, the way I came. That dirt road was bumpy and uneven, but for the most part, it was a straight shot. I didn't even bother to use a mirror at first, just started jetting backwards as quickly as the car would take me. I could feel myself hitting the bumper here and there, but that was a small price to pay in the face of whatever these dudes had planned for me. "Hey, get back here, we're gonna get you fixed up," I heard someone yell over my engine. "Come on, you were so close," another voice hollered. And then, nothing. I bucked back out into the main road. I shifted into drive and blasted towards town. Thankfully, the car was operating better than it ever had. Like that off-road session had corrected some of its own issues. Whatever the case, I was thanking God that I didn't get caught up in whatever the hell was going on back in those woods. It didn't even occur to me until I got back into town that I should probably call the police. I looked back into my messages and of course, Simon had blocked me. I figured he did the same with the phone, which was probably just some kind of burner. Thankfully, I got back home without any incident. I wanted to just go back to bed and sleep it all away, but I was so riled up from that experience. I ended up calling the police and they took a full report. I didn't do any kind of follow-up or anything, but in my gut, I have a feeling that they found him. I keep an eye on the public bookings, people they pick up for various crimes, and I saw Simon amongst the names one week. Only time I ever saw it. The last names didn't match what he had before, but the whole Facebook account was just a lure, or so I believe, to get girls like me to go out into the woods. And the scariest part of it all is the guy almost got me.
Last year, my laptop broke and I really needed a new one. I looked around online and also went to Best Buy, but then I had the idea to look on Facebook Marketplace as well. It seemed like it could be the cheapest and fastest option. I didn't need it to be brand new, and I also didn't want to wait for the shipping time of buying a used one online. So I looked to Facebook Marketplace of people that were close to me. Luckily, I live in an area with quite a few other people. I was able to find the laptop that I wanted and found one for a reasonable price as well. It was not too far away, and I contacted the seller and said that I would like to buy it as soon as possible. The seller got back to me a short time later and told me that I could come over to his house. I didn't like this idea though. Possibly nothing bad would happen and it would be fine, but I didn't want to go to a random guy's house. I responded to him and said that I would rather meet in a public location that was in the area. The man asked why, and I said that I just didn't want to go to someone's house that I didn't know. After a little more of a conversation through Facebook messaging, he finally agreed. He gave me a name of a local restaurant to meet him at and said that he would be there at 9 p.m. I agreed and then went to withdraw some cash. I wasn't all that happy that the man wanted to meet at 9 o'clock at night, but at least it was a public location. I had never been to the restaurant before where he wanted to meet, but that night I drove there and it was a smaller and older looking place. There was nothing else really that close to it, and it was kind of away from the other businesses in the area. The parking lot was in the back, and I parked and then messaged the seller, letting him know that I was there. He responded saying to come inside. After that, I got out of my car and walked inside the restaurant. The place seemed pretty old, and also appeared to be more of a bar than a restaurant. I found a small open table and sat down at a stool and looked around. I couldn't tell where the guy was. His profile picture from Facebook was not of himself, but a logo of a sports team. I looked around to see if there was a guy with a laptop or by himself, but I didn't see anybody. I messaged him, saying that I was there and inside, and asked him where he was. A couple of minutes went by, and I still didn't see him, and he didn't reply either. Finally, after about 5 minutes, I got a notification that he responded. When I read it, he said that he was sorry, but he couldn't make it. I was really confused. He had just texted me earlier telling me to come on inside as if he was there. Now he says he's not going to make it? I was frustrated and decided to just leave. I didn't even want to buy the laptop from him anymore. The guy was just too weird. I was sure that there were plenty of other good laptops for sale, and I wouldn't have a problem finding another one. So I got up and left the bar. I headed out to my car in the parking lot behind the bar and then got inside. Then I started to drive back home. The bar was maybe 15 minutes from my house, and when I got back onto the roads, they were very quiet. But after beginning to drive home, a car left the bar right behind me. I thought nothing of it at first, but the more I drove, it remained right on my tail. After making several turns, it didn't seem like a coincidence anymore. It seemed like whoever was driving that car was deliberately following me, especially because of the fact that they were following really close behind, and if I went faster or slower, they would maintain about the same speed as I was going. When I got within 5 minutes of my apartment, I started to really worry. But part of me was just telling myself, there's no way this car is actually following me. It's just me being paranoid. It was a pickup truck that was following me, and about average size. I really could just see the headlights though, and couldn't tell who was behind the wheel. Finally, I made it to the turnoff for my apartment. I lived in a pretty large complex that had multiple buildings and a huge parking lot. When I pulled in, so did the truck. That was my worst fear. I drove through the parking lot but did not stop. Instead, I drove all the way through and then left the parking lot on the other side. The truck also left with me. At that point, it was pretty much confirmed 100% to me that I was being followed. My adrenaline was rushing and I was desperate to lose the car. But still, I knew better than to speed or drive recklessly. Instead, I started turning onto random streets and into random businesses and restaurant parking lots. Then I would exit out the other side and go back onto the road. It was probably very clear to whoever was behind me now that I knew they were following me and I was trying to lose them. This went on for quite some time though, probably 30 minutes. Soon though, my light came on signaling that I needed to get gas soon. I got really worried. I couldn't keep this up for much longer. The truck was still right on my tail. I kept doing what I was doing and would probably be able to go for about 40 more miles or so. Then, when I made a turn, the truck just went the other way. I couldn't believe it, but it was finally over. I guess he finally gave up. After the truck drove away, I went and got some gas and then went back to my apartment. I was very careful the entire time, and I did not see the truck for the rest of the drive. After getting back home, I realized that the driver of the truck was likely the seller of the laptop. I hadn't really thought about it when I was being followed, but it all made sense now. He told me that he was inside the bar to try to get me to go in. I went back to look at the listing, and it was now gone. The user had blocked me as well, whoever he was. I was a little bit worried because originally I did drive to my apartment complex. but I just hoped that he thought it was the first of all the random places that I turned in to lose him. He also wouldn't know which building I lived in or which unit was mine. Luckily, though, I never saw him again. I also haven't used Facebook Marketplace since that incident. I'm one of those people that's always getting a new phone. I get one almost every year. For me, it's just a personal preference. A lot of times, I trade in my old phone for a new one, but that's not always the case. I happened to just buy a new iPhone a while back, but I still had my old one, so I decided to sell it on Facebook Marketplace. The phone was still pretty new, and I figured that somebody would want it. I listed it for a reasonable price, and within a day, someone had made me an offer. I sold it to them, and after receiving payment, I shipped it to the buyer, which was a man named Elliot. Now, everything seems normal, and it was. He got the phone, and I thought that was the end of that. But maybe like a week later, I got a friend request on Facebook from Elliot, the buyer of the phone. I didn't know him at all, other than that he bought my phone. I clicked on his profile, and I knew that he lived in the same state, in a city that was like an hour or two away. When I clicked on his profile, though, there wasn't all that much information because we weren't friends. I thought that it was kind of weird, though, so I declined his request. The next day, he sent me a message. He asked me why I declined his request and said that he really wanted to be friends with me. I told him, "I just sold you the phone. I don't know you at all other than that. Please don't take it personally. I just don't know you." He kept sending me messages, though. He called me some things that I will not repeat here, and he seemed pretty angry. At that point, I blocked him. It was really strange to say the least, but I thought that was the end of it. Now, Elliot did not contact me through Facebook or any other social media for that matter after that. What he did was much worse. The next night, a few hours after I had gotten home from work, there was a knock on the front door. I walked over to the front of my house and looked out the window to see what looked like Elliot standing there. I couldn't believe that he was actually at my house. I never would have guessed that he would have done that. When I saw this, I jumped back and walked away from the door. He knocked again. There was no way that I was answering the door. This guy had to be insane. I heard him yell that he knew I was home from the other side of the door. I'm not sure how he knew that. Maybe he heard me walking when I went by the door. I didn't think that he saw me when I looked out of the window. Still, I wasn't going to answer it. Instead, I called the police. I told them that a man who I had met on Facebook showed up at my house unannounced and uninvited and would not leave. I was told that somebody would be there shortly, and the police got there much faster than I expected. Elliot basically stayed on my front step. He didn't try to force entry, but he sure wasn't leaving. When the police got there, they talked to him, and then they talked to me as well. Eventually, they got Elliot to leave and told him that if he came back, he would be arrested. He agreed not to come back, and luckily, he kept his word. I haven't seen him or been contacted by him since then. I still can't believe that he did that, though.
Years ago, I was on a cross-country road trip solo to a family reunion. I was supposed to make it to a friend's house, but the weather ended up being horrible and it was slow moving. Then a terrible accident happened just ahead of me. I was stuck in traffic for a while and I ended up being 5 hours behind schedule. At this point, I was exhausted and in need of a bathroom and a shower. So I pulled into a little strip motel off of some back roads. It was obviously small and dirty, but it would work in a pinch. There was a window to the outside where the check-in was. The guy that worked there eyeballed me. Back then, I was a young girl attending college. He then asked me if I was traveling alone. When I went to hand him my ID and credit card, he insisted on cash only. Red flags were going off at this point, but I managed to gather just enough cash and he tossed me the key. The room was dirty and barely bigger than the bed. The first thing I did was go to the bathroom. Then I flipped the mattress, as there were signs of bed bugs, and a moment later, I spied a roach. That was it. I was out. I decided to use the parking space instead and sleep in the back hatch of my SUV. I curled up using a suitcase for a pillow and some random clothes for a blanket, and fell asleep for about an hour. I woke up aware of someone talking on a phone outside. I glanced out to see the guy from the check-in standing outside. It was now around 3 a.m. He finished up his call and walked quietly over to my room, unlocked the door, and walked in. The lights didn't turn on, and a minute or two later he came back out, slamming the door behind him and cursing, with another guy. I hadn't seen two guys enter, so I still don't know where he came from. They angrily talked for a moment, then the check-in guy walked over to my SUV. I covered up my head quickly with a shirt. After he tried the locked door, he peered in the back seat, but between my tinted windows and blending into the general mess, he didn't notice me in the hatch. The two guys walked away to the far side of the parking lot, talking more, one of them gesturing across the street to where a diner was. While they were distracted, I climbed up to the front seat and started up the SUV. They turned around in surprise as I pulled away. I called my friends back home and told them, but I didn't want my family to worry, so I said nothing to them when I arrived. When I got back home about 3 weeks later, we figured out the name of the hotel thanks to Google Maps and called the local police. They told me the place had been closed down only days before I called. When I was younger, each and almost every New Year, my family would pack the car and go on a road trip to visit family in Mexico. We never had any problems until one particular trip when I was 8. Like every road trip before, we left our home in North Texas around 6 p.m. in order to reach our destination the next morning, around 2 a.m. We crossed into Mexico, and this is where things got weird. When you're on the only stretch of freeway in the middle of the desert, you don't tend to freak out about having the same car behind you for miles. It was practically pitch black outside of our car windows, the only visible shapes being the dotted stars and the eerie silhouettes of cacti. We had been in Mexico for about an hour and still had a few more to drive. I remember sleeping but still being semi-conscious of what was going on around me, because I really don't have the skill to really fall asleep in a car. So when my mother suddenly spoke my dad's name, I heard her. "Miguel, that car behind us. It's been behind us since we left Laredo." My dad peeked at the car and shrugged off my mother's tension. "Lots of cars use this road. He's probably going to Reynosa or another city." And he left it at that. Despite his reassurance, my mom kept a weary eye on the car behind us. By this time, my siblings and I were hyper-aware of the car and entertained ourselves by watching the car through the gaps in the luggage that was blocking the rear window. We got tired of that pretty quick. "He's getting closer," my mother noted, and we all turned to watch the car inch closer and closer to ours. "He's too close, Miguel." And she was right. By this time, the car was practically pressed against the rear of our car. On a lonely stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere, with a few hours until daylight, it was downright scary. We couldn't do much. My dad didn't slow down, didn't stop, and he didn't speed away either. He just drove, and the car followed. The next 30 minutes were the most tense we had ever experienced. The car would ease off sometimes, only to press its blinding headlights against our rear once more, like he knew he was freaking us out, and enjoying it. It was during one of the periods that the car had pulled away that Mom spotted a police car up ahead, parked on the side of the road, and she didn't miss a beat. "Miguel, pull over right now in front of the police." And he did. The car kept driving. I wonder how confused the policeman must have been as he watched my dad park the car right in front of him. The policeman came over and asked what was wrong, and my mother urgently told him everything. The car, the way it followed us and taunted us. The policeman took her claims very seriously and told us how people were victimized and had their cars stolen on these empty highways by thugs and criminals. He then offered to drive behind us for a while to make us feel safe. We drove off with the police cruiser behind us, relieved, until about 10 minutes later, when we saw something that confirmed the policeman's words and my mother's worst fears. We saw the car that had followed us pulled over on the side of the road, waiting. I was on a cross-country road trip with a colleague. We were driving through West Texas on a major highway. In the area we were in, even the major highway was pretty desolate. There had been a truck stop or gas station about every 100 miles, and every one of them was solitary with no other buildings in sight. There weren't really any towns. The exits were places to get more gas to get to the next gas station. And my colleague had been driving for about 4 hours. I can usually drive about 8 before I get tired. I go on frequent road trips, but she could only manage about 4 or 5 before it was my turn again. We were also getting low on gas, at about a quarter tank, and you learn from road travel to fill up when you get the chance. So she was looking for a gas station as we drove along. It's really corny, but we were talking about fate and destiny, and how the weird did at the time. That kind of conversation gets me keyed up and worried, so I was trying to change the subject. She took an exit while we were talking, and I got out my coffee mug so I could fill it up, as it was my turn to drive. We pulled into a typical Nowhereville gas station. It had a trailer out back. I assumed thinking back it was probably where the people who owned it lived. There was another car parked in front of the doors off to one side. We got out, still talking, and walked up to the double doors, each of us grabbing a door handle. The doors were locked. I turned and looked around to see if there was a sign. Sometimes places will put up, "Back in 5 minutes," and I noticed several things in succession. The coffee pot inside was halfway done, brewing a fresh pot of coffee. The monitors that showed the store were visible from the outside, where we were, but all of them were showing static. There was a splash of bright red on the door in the back of the place, which was closed. I suddenly realized that I was looking at a huge streak of blood with handprints in it. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up. My friend began shaking the door and yelling, "We need to get gas." But I had already turned and walked away from the doors. I then said, "We have to leave now." I grabbed her by the arm and started propelling her back to the car. Now I noticed the other car in the lot had no plates. It was dingy and had dents. There was an empty gun rack in the window of it. I ran to the car, dragging her with me. She seemed to take forever to open the doors. The whole time she kept saying, "But we need gas." Well, I tried to explain to her, "There's blood in there. Blood." After what seemed like a year, she pulled the car out. When we were backing up, I saw through the windows that the back door to the gas station was opening, but we had pulled away before anyone came out, thankfully. I was freaking out until we were about 20 miles down the highway. I tried to call the police, but I had no signal, and I didn't get one until we had driven about 40 miles and got to a truck stop. I called the cops. They thanked me, and I never heard anything more about it. To this day, I feel like if I hadn't have freaked out, we might have met the robber, or whoever was in the back room of that place. I also wish I would have been able to find out what the hell happened there. It was a Chevron station, somewhere in the western part of Texas.
Last year, I was traveling back from college to go home. My college was about a 10-hour drive, and I had initially planned to drive through the night, but at about 2 in the morning, I was overcome with sleepiness, and knowing I still had about 4 hours to drive, I decided I needed to stop. I saw a sign for a rest stop, and I pulled off. The rest stop was fairly quiet, and I parked in the corner. I extended my seat back and closed my eyes. I was so tired that I fell right asleep. Sometime later, though, I woke up. I looked out my windshield to see it was still dark out. Then I turned my head to my driver's side window to see a man standing at the window looking in. He had a beard, and as soon as he saw me looking at him, he started to smile. I freaked out and started scrambling to find my keys. He then tried opening my door. It was locked, of course, and then the man began knocking at the window. I found my keys that were in the cup holder and started my car as fast as I could. I pulled out of there and drove all the way home. I arrived home safely at 7 a.m. I never plan on sleeping at a rest stop again. A couple years ago, my wife and I were doing a cross-country road trip. We were heading west, and somewhere along the way, we stopped for the night at a rest stop. We didn't mind sleeping in our car, and we wanted to save money on hotels. This rest stop had a little building with bathrooms and some vending machines in it. At about 11:30 p.m., I went in it to brush my teeth. It had a pretty decent-sized bathroom, and it looked well taken care of. There was about 5 stalls and 5 sinks as well, and it had good lighting. I got out my toothbrush and started brushing. I noticed that someone was in the far stall on the end because I saw feet on the floor, but other than that, there was no one else in there. When I finished brushing my teeth, I left the bathroom and started walking back down the hall of the rest stop when I heard a stall door slam shut very loudly from the bathroom. Then it happened again and again. There was a stall door being repeatedly opened and shut. The man that was in there must have been slamming it over and over again. It kind of creeped me out, and I walked faster to get back to our car. Once I got back to the car, I was very tired and we went right to sleep. I woke up in the night and I really had to pee. I got out of our car quietly so I didn't wake up my wife. When I got out, I looked at my phone to see that it was 2:42 a.m. I walked back into the rest stop and into the bathroom. As soon as I stepped in, I remembered the man and I saw someone was in the far stall again. The shoes appeared to be the same as the man's before. The bathroom only had stalls, so I went in the closest one to the door. As soon as I shut the stall, I heard the one on the far end open. I heard the man walk from the end and then stop directly in front of my stall. I turned around to see through the crack that he was looking right at me. He then tried opening it. I said, "What do you want?" in a nervous voice. There was no answer. I had to think quickly of how I could get out of there. The man seemed to be insane. I stuck my foot under the side of the stall as if I was going to go under the stalls to the one next to me. The man moved a little to his left. At that moment, I pushed the stall open as fast as I could and into the man, pushing him back. I took off and sprinted to the door and ran out of the bathroom. He began chasing after me, and I could hear him about 10 feet behind me. I didn't bother to look back at all. I just ran as fast as I could. I ran all the way to my car, jumped inside, and locked the doors literally 2 or 3 seconds before the man got to the car and started trying the doors before he started banging on my window. My wife woke up and started freaking out. She was very confused. I didn't have time to explain. I started the engine and drove off faster than I ever have before in my life. As I drove away, I saw the man just stand there and stare at me. My wife was in shock, and I tried to explain everything to her. Eventually, we stopped at another rest stop about 20 miles down the road to sleep the rest of the night. But after that, we haven't been to a rest stop since. Every year, a couple of friends and I take a road trip out west. Last time, we were about halfway through the trip when we decided to stop at a rest stop in Colorado. It was about 11 p.m. We weren't going to spend the night there, but we just needed to stop to use the restroom and stretch our legs. The rest stop was very unique. It was rather large and near some mountains. However, not very many people were there. In fact, I didn't see any other cars in the parking lot at all. My friends went in to use the bathrooms. I stayed back to check the oil on the car, and once they got back, I went in. The rest stop had several displays of local attractions and things like that, as well as the typical bathrooms and vending machines. As I went in the bathroom, I heard someone walk in the rest stop and walk towards the bathroom, but nobody went in. It sounded like they were just standing outside. Once I left the bathroom, nobody was there. I heard footsteps walking around the corner, but once I got around the corner, no one was there. Then I heard them from back near the bathrooms where I just was. This confused me a lot, and I walked back around the corner to see nobody was there again. I guess maybe my friends were somehow pulling a prank on me. I started to walk back, and then I heard someone shaking the vending machine near the door. Now I knew it had to be my friends, and I walked over to see the vending machines, and of course, nobody was there. I just shook my head and walked back out to the car to see all my friends inside waiting for me. I asked them if they were inside at all, but they all told me no. I suddenly got the creeps and said we should get out of there. We drove away and got to our hotel. I still don't know who or what was making those noises. Last year, my parents and I drove to New York. I was 14 at the time. On the last day before arriving, we were in upstate New York and stopped at a rest stop to get food. The rest stop was rather large and busy. It had about 5 restaurants in it. There must have been at least 100 people inside. We went in and saw there was lines for every restaurant. My parents wanted tacos, but I wanted pizza, so I got in the line for pizza, and they went around the corner. I got in the end of the line. There was maybe 5 people in front of me. I stood there and waited. After about a minute, I felt 2 arms grab my shoulders. I thought it was my dad, but when I looked, it was some guy who looked like he was 50 or 60. He had on a leather jacket and grayish hair. He was smiling and asked me what kind of pizza I was buying. I told him cheese, and he said he would buy it for me. I said no thanks, but he insisted. I figured free pizza is free pizza, so I said all right. He talked to me the entire time we were in line, just asking me lots of basic questions about myself. I was hoping my parents would come over. I couldn't see them because the taco place was around the corner. Eventually, he got the pizza for me, and I told him I needed to get back to my parents. He told me he saw them go outside, and they were waiting for me, and started to lead me outside. Looking back, I can't believe I was so stupid, but I actually believed him. We walked outside, and we got towards the parking lot, but I could see my car, and my parents were not there. I started to turn around, but the man put his arm around my shoulder and kept walking. I asked him where we were going. He started to walk faster, and his grip got tighter. He just kept smiling and told me to shut up. I then told the man to let me go. He said shut up again. We reached his car, which was parked in the far corner. I was not going to get in his car. I yelled at him to let me go as loud as I could before he covered my mouth. I was able to get some people's attention. A woman came over to us. The man said I was just being difficult and everything was fine. I told her no it wasn't, and I used this opportunity to run to the woman. The man continued to try to pretend that I was with him, but I could tell the woman wasn't buying it, and I told her to call the police. At this moment, the man got into his car and drove off. I am disappointed to say I didn't get the license plate, but I did get back to my parents, who called the police, and they questioned me. I don't believe the man was ever caught, but I'm sure glad I wasn't abducted. I am a 23-year-old female. This story took place last summer. I had just recently gotten a new car. Well, actually it was used, but it was only 8 years old and was much better than the 2003 car I had been driving. The car had no problems, but did need to get its tires rotated. So about a week after I bought it, I took it to a local mechanic. I had never been to the guy before, but his prices seemed pretty low. I drove the car to the shop, which was located on a quiet end of town and not really next to anything else. I went inside and gave the mechanic the keys. I had made the appointment online, and when I got there, he said it would be about 30 minutes or less and told me I could wait in the waiting room while the work was done. I went in and sat down in a chair in the waiting room. There was nobody else at the shop, and it was rather old. The place looked like it hadn't been updated at all since the 1980s. They even had a big box TV that was on, and it played the Weather Channel on it. I sat down and went on my phone for this time. When about 20 minutes had passed, the mechanic came back in and said that my car was done. After that, I drove back home and everything was normal. But about a week later, I was driving home from work one night, and I heard what sounded like a faint buzzing noise. I I thought it was a bug in the car at first, so I rolled down a few windows and hoped it would fly out. But the sound kept going, and after I put the windows back up and listened closer, I could hear it wasn't exactly the sound of a bug. I drove the rest of the way home, and then turned my car off and listened. I didn't hear anything for a few seconds, but then I heard it again. I looked around my car and saw something behind the mirror. It was a little black thing that was mounted, and when I examined it, it appeared to be a camera. It was very well hidden, and I hadn't noticed it until looking extremely close. I ended up looking very closely around the rest of my car, and I ended up finding 2 more cameras. I took them inside and later brought them to the police. It turned out the mechanic put them in my car to spy on me. It was extremely creepy, and I never should have took my car to him in the first place.
I'm a 46-year-old male, and while I wouldn't say I've had a life of danger and intrigue, I have worked a handful of unusual jobs. I've traveled a good bit, and have some interesting life experiences. I've also inherited some strange traits from my father, which attracts weirdos, crazies, and the troublemakers. I don't know if it's my appearance or just some sort of aura, but if I'm in a crowd and there's a mentally unstable homeless person in the vicinity, you can damn well bet that they're going to approach me. When I tell people this, they often think that I'm kidding or exaggerating, but those who are around me long enough will eventually find out that it's all true. Over the years, I've amassed a collection of stories, most of them being humorous, strange, and just interesting tales. But I do have a few stories that are just downright scary. Today, I would like to share one of those with you. On a final note before I begin, I've included some details in this story that may seem unrelated to the incident itself. My reasoning for doing so is not only because I think the setting and context are significant, but also because I've got more stories from this awful period in my life. This will make a lot more sense once you hear the story. Now let the fun begin. Back in the early 2000s, I was living in the city of Pittsburgh and worked as a credit manager for a rental company. A few years prior, I had foolishly dropped out of college and was living in an apartment that I couldn't really afford. Bills were starting to pile up. I needed to find a job with a decent wage. A friend contacted me and told me that he was leaving his job. The company would be looking for a replacement. When he first told me about the job, I naively thought the company rented out furniture and appliances to businesses just for events, and once they were finished renting the items, they would conveniently be returned. How hard could that be? Boy, was I in for a rude awakening. After I got hired, I found out that the company's business model was to rent to own, and they preyed on welfare recipients and people with low incomes. The cheap rental rates for furniture, TVs, stereos, and appliances were enticing to those who couldn't afford such things. But unbeknownst to the renters, the items would take years to pay off. These people would end up paying 10 times more than what the item was really worth. My job title was just a fancy name for a repo man. If someone couldn't pay or refused to pay, it was my job to hunt them down and repossess those items. Oddly, out of all the insane situations that I'd encountered while out repoing in the projects, this occurrence actually took place behind the store on my day off. It's important to note that generally, when you see a rent-to-own store, it's either or near a rough neighborhood. Usually, they're located conveniently near one of those payday loan stores or a token liquor store. The shopping plaza where we were located wasn't in that bad of an area, but it was closest to the shopping center to the nearby projects. I'd heard a rumor that the plaza's large parking lot was a hotbed for drug activity. And while it wasn't that uncommon to see multiple lit up police cars in the lot, I never knew if it was just drug bust or maybe just crackheads shoplifting. Now, being this was my day off, work was the last place that I wanted to be, but the van that I drove at the time was having engine troubles. So when my shift ended on the previous night, I left the van in the back of the store and then got a ride from a coworker who lived nearby. The plan was to get a ride back to the store in the late morning, bring my tools and work on the van, and hopefully, get it back up and running. I remember that it was actually a beautiful summer day, which is pretty rare in Pittsburgh, so I was happy at least that I didn't have to work out in the rain. The back of the store looked like your typical loading dock area that you would see at any shopping plaza throughout the US. The plaza itself was fairly large and roughly 300 yards long. Across from the loading docking area was where all these stores kept their dumpsters. Beyond the dumpsters, there was overgrown weeds and bushes, then railroad tracks, and eventually a wooded area that ran along the Monongahela River. Our store was located smack dab in the middle of that shopping center. I ended up getting there a little later than I wanted to. My van was high enough that I didn't need to jack it up, so I threw down some cardboard and just got immediately to work. There were some preliminary things that I had to do before I got to whatever the real, actual problem was, so I didn't really get things apart until by afternoon. And by then, it was moving back and forth between the driver's seat and the space between the van. Hours ticked by, and soon, the sun was starting to go down. I don't remember exactly how long I was under there or had been working, but I remembered that I was in the driver's seat, trying to get the van started. At this point, I thought I had it pretty much pegged. I was pulling myself out from underneath the van, and I heard distant running footsteps. I stood up and saw this skinny dude about 75 yards away from me, running toward me. Aside from the immediate thinking that it was an odd place to be out for a jog, I didn't think much more of it. As he got closer to me, I nodded and said hi. But when he looked at me, it was the look of pure fear and panic. This man wasn't jogging, he was full on sprinting. He was younger than I initially thought. Maybe he was in his mid-20s and he was casually dressed, but they definitely weren't clothes that you'd wear while jogging. Completely confused, I just stood there, watched him run toward the dumpsters and then disappear. While it was odd, you usually don't see people in the back of the plaza. I was used to seeing weirdos and the occasional river people, or just homeless people who camped out near the riverbank. I shrugged it off and decided to get back to work. Around 30 seconds later, I hear footsteps once again. I see another man running toward me. As he approached, I could tell this man was bigger and maybe in his late 30s. He had a beard and was wearing a hat. There's something about him that was a lot more intimidating though. I'm 6'2", and at the time, I weighed about 215 pounds. People often said that I looked intimidating, to which you kinda had to at the job that I was at, but it only took one look from this man to know that he wasn't somebody to f with. Once he was within about 10 yards from me, he yelled, "Where is he? Where'd he go?" Without hesitation, I quickly pointed towards the dumpsters. Looking back, I felt like a pushover, just doing what this stranger told me to do. But there was this assertiveness about this guy that just made me instantly comply. This is where it starts to get crazy. Together with the bearded man walking just slightly behind me, I began to head over toward the dumpsters, which were maybe 25 yards away. Thinking by now that skinny guy was long gone, probably deep in the wooded area near the river, I was just going to point out in the general direction to where he ran. But as we approached the dumpsters, I noticed a crouching figure behind one of them, and all of a sudden I hear, "Get the f out here now!" When I turned around, I saw that bearded man. He was now a few feet away from me, aiming a gun directly at Skinny Guy. Dumbfounded, I just stood there, frozen, as if I couldn't process what was all going on. Skinny Guy stands up and hesitantly walks towards the bearded man, who grabs him and shouts to him immediately. He throws him onto the pavement. I was soon snapped out of my frozen state by the sound of screeching tires. At the opposite end of the plaza, maybe 150 yards away, I turned to see a pickup fishtailing around the bend, headed straight for us at full speed. It was at this moment I realized I needed to get the hell out of this situation, instead of just standing there with my mouth hanging open. I ran back toward my van and just hid behind it. I see the pickup truck slam on its brakes just a few feet away from Skinny Guy on the ground. Two armed men get out of the truck. Another armed man jumps down from the back of the truck. All the men were yelling angrily. Two of the men grab Skinny Guy and yank him up off the ground. They drag him to the back of the pickup, and at gunpoint, one of them yells, "Get in the f***ing truck!" They made Skinny Guy lie down, face first, on the truck bed. At this point, you can no longer see him. Two of the men get inside the cab, while the other two, still with guns drawn, climb back into the truck bed. As they're about to leave, the two men in the truck bed hunch down and try to look less conspicuous. Well, I could no longer see their guns. It was obvious by the way that their arms were extended. They still had their guns aimed at the skinny guy's head. They sped off and disappeared around that bend. For a split moment, I just stood there in disbelief, wondering what the hell I just witnessed. It all happened so fast. After the bearded man drew his gun, it seemed like from his perspective, I no longer even existed. Who the hell were those guys? Were they members of some criminal organization or drug dealers? Maybe they were even undercovers for the DEA. I thought of the possibilities that maybe they were even dirty cops. You'd think if they were law enforcement or DEA, they would have at least announced it and talked like cops, or maybe even used handcuffs. Yet if they were criminals, they sure seemed organized. Didn't seem to care about waving their guns around either. Nor did they care about the fact that I was witnessing all of it. Shortly after I had these thoughts and they ran through my head, I ran into the store to tell my coworkers what just happened. I honestly can't remember who was all there that day, but I distinctly remember two of my coworkers who were there. We'll call them Sarah and Mark to protect their identities. Sarah was the receptionist, Mark was the store manager. When I told them everything that just happened, they were both said something to the effect of, "Damn, that's crazy." Yet it was like they couldn't comprehend the severity of what really happened. It wasn't like they completely shrugged it off, but they didn't seem to be as shocked as I was. It was absolutely wild to me, the difference in our reactions. They were just pretty much focused on closing down. I was out back, frontline to the chaos. It was a perfect dichotomy. I thought maybe it was because everyone in this godforsaken place had become so numb to the insanity, used to hearing crazy stories from the so-called road dogs like myself. Honestly, they probably weren't all that surprised to hear the people behind the store were waving guns around. After seeing their underwhelmed reactions, I regained my composure and went back outside to finish working on my van. About a half an hour later, I saw two men slowly walking behind the dumpster area, where the pavement ended and the weeds began. Occasionally, they would stop and look through the weeds and bushes, and eventually made their way onto the railroad tracks, still looking as if they were searching for something. They weren't there for very long, and after a few minutes of looking around, they just walked away and disappeared. After that, I never heard or saw from any of those guys ever again. To this day, I don't know why I didn't report any of this incident to the police. I guess a part of me suspected they were somehow involved. My theory was the armed men were undercover cops, either police or DEA. They'd staged a drug deal and were running surveillance on one, and then they tried to arrest the skinny guy, or else maybe he grew suspicious and that's why he fled the scene. After fleeing, the skinny guy stashed or tossed the drugs somewhere, hence the guy who were looking around afterwards. That seems to be the most plausible scenario. Yet another part of me has some doubts about it all. Something about the whole thing was just off, and while it's not like the incident haunts my conscience on a daily basis or anything, sometimes I do get this guilty feeling, as if I ratted that skinny guy out and sent him to his death. Unfortunately or fortunately, I'll never know. I ended up quitting that job almost a year later. I worked there for 3 years, and toward the end, I began to notice that I'd become very cynical, mean, and depressed. I also became a heavy drinker, among other things, and I knew I had to get out of that place and find a new path, which thankfully eventually I did. Anyhow, I've tried to bury and forget most of these memories from that time in my life, but there were a few repo incidents that I can't forget, like the time I almost had to jump out of a second-story window, or the time I had to hide from a customer's psychotic husband. If there's anyone interested in these stories, leave a comment. Life is pretty busy these days, so it may take me some time, but I enjoy writing and have plenty to write about. Thanks for listening.
Back in my senior year of high school, I worked at a local gas station to help my mom and brother with rent. It definitely wasn't the best paying job, but it helped us get by to the point where we were in a much better financial position than we were. While on the job, you definitely had to deal with many issues with customers, especially during the night. These types of customers usually ranged from the drunk types to the more aggressive types. Thankfully, the area I worked at was relatively safe, so I mainly got people who came in wanting a beer or a midnight snack. There was this one night, however, that will never leave me. It is absolutely true, and it's something that definitely chilled me to the bone. I had been scheduled to work one night as the person who was supposed to be working had called out. This made me annoyed as it was supposed to be my day off, but in the end, the night shifts were relatively chill. I drive over to work at around 8 p.m. and began my shift as usual by clocking in. I'd say right away, several customers came in, mostly paying for gas or a quick drink. On this night, the same routine happened, and it wasn't until 11ish where people would stop coming in as the night would die down. Fast forward till around 2 a.m. I'm behind the counter playing Sudoku to pass time when I see a car pull in. I think nothing of it and just assume it's probably someone wanting a snack or something. However, I then see a woman step out of the driver's side, looking up at the security camera. She seemed to be around her early 30s, wearing nothing but a sweater and some jeans. The way she stared at the camera, though, just seemed like she was watching it for no apparent reason. After a good minute, she then walks into the store and right away starts talking to herself. I couldn't really make out as to what she was saying, but if I had to say, it sounded like she was talking about a person named John. I just minded my business and figured that she had some sort of mental disorder. In fact, my cousin suffered from something similar, so it immediately hit close to home. She walks around seemingly cautiously around the shelves while biting her nails as if she were worried about something. Part of me wanted to ask if she needed help, but the other part of me didn't. Eventually, she casually picks up a candy bar, and I gladly ring her up while telling her the total. However, she doesn't get out a credit card or even cash, and just stands there looking dead at me while talking about this John guy. I'm not really sure what it was, but there was something about her eyes and nose that gave off such an eerie feeling, not to mention that she kind of looked like the girl from the Ring movie. After what felt like hours, I just said that she could take the candy as I didn't want the situation to be more awkward than it already was. With that, she finally left and got in her car, driving off in what seemed like a hurry. For the next 2 hours, I waited until my shift was over when the person working after me had come in. It was around 5 a.m. and had gone home to go to sleep and woke up at around 12 to several missed calls from an unknown number. The thing that struck me the most was this one and only voicemail that was left. I put it on speaker and instantly became shocked when I hear the same voice of the woman repeatedly saying John louder and louder. This was followed by a very loud, high-pitched scream at the end which made my blood run cold. It was something I've never heard before, as it didn't even sound human. I have no idea how she got my number or who John is or was. Long story short, I end up getting my number changed very quickly, where I thankfully never heard or saw her again. Before I begin, I want to point out that there is something very off about my story. This took place around 12 years ago, and it's still one of the most creepiest and unexplainable experiences I've had. I'll try my best to explain my encounter in the best detail as possible. This happened when I was in my late 30s on a road trip with my mom and sister. We had all been driving cross-country somewhere in the southern US. Looking back, I can't remember what state it was, but if I had to guess, I'd say it was somewhere between Texas and Oklahoma. It was around 11 at night, and I remember we had found ourselves on an interstate that night in need of food and gas. Thankfully, my sister had pointed out that she had seen a sign that had a rest stop up ahead. It seemed to be the only gas station for several miles, so with no other choice, we had to stop there. We pull in, and right off the bat, we see a van full of teenagers and two men standing by a small gray car. We weren't sure as to what it was, but almost immediately, something about this place seemed very wrong. My sister and I had went inside the gas station to use the restroom, but the strange part was that there was no gas station attendant anywhere. On our way out, we had overheard the teenagers say that they had felt creeped out and that the gas pump wasn't even working. The teenagers leave in a hurry, but the two men by the car hadn't moved at all, just standing there. Not talking, not on their phones, nothing. However, as my sister turned to look at the men, she had claimed to see their eyes being black, dark, and empty. The both of us get into the car and floored it out of there and didn't stop until we hit the next city. After we had made it to our destination, we had looked just about everywhere on a map but couldn't find that gas station anywhere. We had figured that it was maybe due to the fact that it was just too small to be a location. In the next city over, we had asked around and told some of the locals about the station on the interstate. We even went out of our way to give them the exact location of it, but only got confused looks. Some people say they didn't know about it or simply said that there was no gas station there. Overall, it was a really weird experience and none of us can figure it out till this day. We had been down that interstate since, but had never seen that gas station again. The interstate is a very small 2-lane road, so if there was something there, you would have seen it. A few days into our stay, and we had spoken to a guy who had claimed to be a trucker and had told us similar stories. In the end, we had accepted the fact that there was no rest stop there. I still get chills thinking about it till this day. Sometimes I like to think that maybe this was a dream or a deja vu episode. We don't really tell many people about this, as we'd assume most would think we're crazy or lying. Either way, this was and still is one of the most creepiest and unexplainable encounters we've ever experienced. To be honest with you, I'm not really sure what we saw. We even asked more locals about it too. A few months later, we learned that a family had gone missing for nearly a week near the area of the station. They were eventually found, as well as their station wagon. The strange part was that they basically abandoned their car. When they were found, they all seemed to be out of it, especially their children. They seemed sort of spacey and fuzzy. As far as we know, everyone is fine now, but I'm starting to believe they saw the same thing. However, up until now, there have been no leads, and that gas station has never been found.